And I'm going to, the agenda, which I will project here, says has my name down to next to agenda overview, but I think I'll turn it over to Yvonne. She was the main person in getting the agenda organized, so I'll turn it over to her to review the agenda. Other than that, just for any latecomers, welcome to the this meeting, EWG meeting. It's on today from 10 to 2:30ish, and then resumes again on Wednesday at what time does it start on Wednesday? 9 or 9:30, something like that.
9 o'clock.
9 o'clock. So with that, I'll turn it over to Yvonne and to review the agenda and any other opening remarks and announcements, welcome, so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you so much, Kit. So Kit, I'm going to actually start with a bit of administration and ask you to please make sure that both Stephanie Zador and Corey Green are able to share their screens and be presenters this morning.
Yep, I'm in the process of trying to do that.
Thank you so much. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is sort of an in-between meeting of the Ecosystem Workgroup, and we when we set up this meeting, we thought we were preparing for the September Council meeting, but we are having to have a report to the June Council meeting. And it's going to be a very packed agenda, so we're going to try to just roll through everything, but we would also like to take advantage of all the different folks who are joining us for this call and have sort of more free and open discussion. But I will confess I'm a little nervous about that. So if we have a speaker and you have a question of the speaker, please do ask that question and help us sort of draw out the kind of information that we need to figure out how better to understand and use things like risk tables and stoplight tables. If you have a question that's more like, why isn't the EWG doing this? Or when is the EWG going to do that? Or I think the EWG should do X, Y, or Z. Please save that for the public comment period at the end of the day. So questions on topic are very welcome. Questions sort of bigger picture and off topic for the moment are, please table them for later. So with that, we've also had a request that if you are speaking, you turn your camera on. Like I said earlier, we do have a packed agenda, and it's a very hot day here in Seattle, and I'm sure farther south. So I suspect a lot of people like me will be drinking a lot of water, which will mean that we need to take breaks periodically, but I'm going to urge everyone to take their breaks when they need them. Obviously not when you're chairing an item. So Ecosystem Workgroup members, if you would please find the notes page, the agenda and notes page that I sent out last Friday, and then I'd like to ask different people to take notes for different agenda items. And I'll just start by rolling through the agenda and see and look for hands or comments from people who are willing to take notes during the different agenda items. So we are starting no later than 10:15. We will have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Stephanie Zador of the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And she has been working with the North Pacific Council for a long time on ecosystem issues, and was one of the, for many years, was the lead coordinator of the of Alaska's ecosystem considerations reports, and had a lot of responsibility for developing that process and influencing what ecosystem status reports think about and look like nationwide. So it's a really great honor to have Stephanie here today. And I'm so pleased and grateful that she was willing to spend some time with us. So that is from 10:15 till 10:45. And then We are also honored to have Dr. Corey Green of the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, who is currently the Habitat Committee Chair, and he's been one of our amazing habitat scientists for years and involved in sort of both the council process and the sort of big picture policy making and bringing science into the policy process there, but also more on the salmon habitat side and salmon habitat science. And so, again, just really honored to have Corey come and talk to us and talk to us about the salmon stoplight tables, because I think that's something that is interesting and unique about the Pacific Council is the development of these intricate stoplight tables for a lot of different salmonid species, and we have to think about what does that look like for our council and whether we might use those stoplight tables for other species, and how might we think about and use the stoplight tables for different stocks of salmon managed by the council. So that is 10:45 to 11:15, and then there's a little bit of a padding there from 11:15 to 12. Where if we go over from the prior speakers, we'll still be fine, but we want to have a little bit of a chat about stoplight tables versus risk tables. Do you need to do one to have the other? Whether we like using one versus another in the council process, what we think about, sort of where the council might go with that, or our council process. And then and I should have said earlier, Tommy Moore is going to be chairing us during Corey Green's talk, which is great because Tommy knows a lot more about salmon than I do. And then Jamil Samhori will be chairing us during the species selection criteria discussion from 12:30 to 1:30. So for those of you, you may recall that in March, we said to the council, going forward, we would suggest that you not just choose species randomly, but go through some kind of selection and think about the criteria for that. And we asked all of the advisory bodies to weigh in on what they thought were useful species selection criteria, and many of them did, which was great. And so we've sort of modified that list. And so Jamil is going to work with us on fine-tuning that list and figuring out whether we can sort of propose a final list of species selection criteria by September and see what the council thinks about that. Then, Kit, if you would scroll down a bit, please, so I can find where we're going next. Then Jessica is going to chair us on, Jessica Watson from ODF&W is going to chair us on management schedules for groundfish, salmon, and coastal pelagics. And so, again, something we did in March was get the council to talk with us in March and get the advisory bodies to think about what are their harvest management schedules, and think about where in their processes that information, any ecosystem and climate information, might be most useful. So at any rate, we're going to firm up those management schedules, talk about when in the management processes might be useful to bring in ecosystem and climate information. And again, we're not going to come up with final recommendations for June. We'll just preliminary ideas maybe that we'll share with them from the discussion. And then at 2:15, we have the last 15 minutes of the day reserved for public comment, and that would be, again, sort of general public comment about where you think the initiative should go or not. And if you have specific comments about things that we addressed previously, but you didn't think of them at the time, then we can try to answer those as well. All right, so with that, does anyone have any questions? And I'm going to just say I'm not always great at monitoring the chat. So, okay, so Will Satterthwaite asked in the chat for item E, is the real issue species selection or stock selection? Okay, that is a good question, Will, and we can certainly talk about that under agenda item E. I would just say off the top of my head, based on the SSC Ecosystem Subcommittee meeting, of last fall, I think we're all in for stock selection for those species for which it applies. So, and again, feel free to put information in the chat. We probably won't see it in the instant that you have it, but sometimes I know as a compulsive writer myself, it's easy sometimes for me to just blurt out my ideas in the chat when I'm trying to be polite while other people are talking. So, and hi, Don, thank you. Actually, Don Vernon in the chat introduced himself. I'm gonna just ask people to do that in the last remaining minute or so. If you are attending the meeting, please just say hello in the chat, your name and your association. And then we're gonna see if we can get Stephanie up and rolling. And I guess any other questions or comments about the agenda, anything that you want to change for today? Okay, good. So let's see, let's test Stephanie's microphone and see if she can speak. And then Kit, I'm going to assume that you took care of business and see if Stephanie can share her screen.
Hi, Yvonne. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. I will try my video now. Yes. Okay. This is my first time using the Ring Central program. So yeah, if there's technical difficulties, just help me out, please. And so now, let's see. Are you seeing my screen? I still see the grid of people's faces.
Yes, we are seeing your screen. And I think if for people like me, so what I'm seeing, everyone, is a relatively small rectangle in the middle. And I think that's because of how I have it arranged on my side, not because of how Stephanie has it arranged on her side. So think about messing around with your, I think it's under the More button where you can rearrange the presentation mode.
Yeah, there's a little drop down on the upper right hand corner, and you can try one of those. Maybe if you switch to speaker view, you'll get a bigger view of the slides. But you, like Yvonne said, you can play around with that, see if it helps.
Okay, with that, thank you so much, Stephanie, and please go ahead and enlighten us.
Sure. Thank you, Yvonne and others. Welcome. Good morning. And I'm pleased to be here. Yvonne asked for an overview of our development and the use of risk tables that we are practicing for the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. And so let's see if I can advance the slides. Here we go. Okay. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, but a few points that I think might be different from the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. The one that's most salient is that we set our fisheries quotas annually, which plays an important role in how sort of risk tables came about. And we do this for groundfish and crab, but for today, I'm really only talking about groundfish, which is how we started this. So just as sort of quick orientation, there are 5 large marine ecosystems. Sometimes you hear 4 or 5, et cetera. But, and we have groundfish fisheries management plans, but they don't always match the large marine ecosystems. So we have one for the Gulf of Alaska and then one fishery management plan for the Eastern Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands together. And I'll be focusing on, taking examples from these 2 areas because the Arctic, the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea, there's no real federal fishing up there. So risk tables and the way we do stock assessments doesn't apply currently. One exception to this is sablefish, which are actually managed statewide. So there's one Alaska sablefish stock assessment. And just also, each of these 2 groundfish fishery management plans, the Gulf of Alaska and BSAI, have optimum yield ranges, but the upper ends actually function as caps in our ecosystem. And so that comes into play when ABCs are translated to tags. Anyhow, moving on. So this is my little schematic of how the annual catch limit setting process works for groundfish. The single species stock assessment model, the models that are used for producing the acceptable biological catch and the overfishing levels each year is shown there, represented by that funnel, just sort of indicating that there's lots of different types of data that go into these models. Of course, there's fishery data and all the research survey data. And some of these models that we use already in the process do already include ecosystem data, but not all. Anyhow, one of the values that come out of these stock assessment models is the maximum acceptable biological catch. And so, but as there's this point where actually I should ask, can you see my mouse or no? Oh yeah, it looks like you can. Okay.
Yeah.
So the stock assessment author, the lead author, has an opportunity to recommend an ABC that's lower than the maximum that is estimated by the stock assessment model. And this has always been the case in this system. And this happens because sometimes there's factors, things going on sort of that aren't accounted for in the stock assessment model, but the author believes there's reason for it to be taken into account in setting the ABC. So it can never be higher, but it can be a lower ABC. And that value is then it's either the max ABC or something that's lower that goes through 2 levels of review. So first, it gets reviewed by our groundfish plan teams. They can either accept that lower level or the max ABC or change it. And then it goes through another level review with our scientific and statistical committee, and they're the ones that set the final ABC. And then that value then gets translated by the council and with these OY caps, et cetera, to then deal with allocation, et cetera, and where the quotas come from in the end, the tax, the total allowable catch. So it's in this sort of decision whether or not to reduce the ABC from the maximum that's estimated by the stock assessment model, which is the on-ramp for any sort of what we call contextual ecosystem information that comes into play that's not already accounted for in the population dynamics model. So the contextual ecosystem information generally comes from 2 sources. One is our ESRs, ecosystem status reports, which we have for each of the 3 large marine ecosystems in question. They're really tailored to the council, and they're really tailored to this process of informing ABC through this, sort of providing this contextual information that's not already in the stock assessment model. And so the production and the presentation of the ESRs is very closely linked with this stock assessment cycle. And the presentations happen at the same time as well, in the same sessions as the stock assessment models are discussed. Another place where that contextual ecosystem information comes from are our ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles, ESPs. This is an effort that's been spearheaded by Kalei Shotwell at our center. And these are essentially stock-specific ecosystem information. So they're standardized frameworks for ecosystem and socioeconomic factors. They're appendices within the stock assessments, and they act as proving grounds. And there's certain levels, if it's a way to test if a stock-specific ecosystem indicator is really strongly informative for the assessment model. After a few years in the ESP, it could then theoretically move into the stock assessment model, at which point it wouldn't be addressed in the risk table because it would no longer be contextual ecosystem information if it's already in the stock assessment model. So these ESPs were introduced in 2017 with a sablefish ESP, and over the years, there have been some developed for a number of other stocks, but we don't have them yet for all stocks. Should I be checking for questions in the chat? I'm sorry, I see, no.
No, go ahead. We'll have questions following.
Okay. Okay. So how this works, as I mentioned, we've got this annual harvest specification process, and each stock assessment, of course, is stock-based. And then we have the LME-based ESRs. And then for some of the stock assessments, we have these stock-based ESPs appended to the stock assessment. And within the front of the stock assessment is the risk table. So for each stock, they pull information from those one or two sources, depending on if they're ESPs. So the reason why risk tables came about is that I said we've always had that process where the author can recommend an ABC that's lower than is estimated by the stock assessment model. But that contextual ecosystem information had been used kind of in an ad hoc fashion, and it was hard to even document because it really came down to discussions that were happening with the plan teams or the SSC and who was taking notes and whether they took careful notes or not, you know. But the council has long been receiving ecosystem information because we started producing ESRs in 1993. And so this is an ongoing process. I'm not describing anything new. What's new is that these risk tables now formalize that process, which allows us to document what information was considered, whether or not it impacted the ABC. And that whether or not is the part that wasn't happening at all in the ad hoc system. So what precipitated this was in October 2017, we had a big decline in the Gulf of Alaska Pacific cod stock. And the SSC had been receiving this ecosystem information about all these things going on starting in 2015 with cod being sick and this huge marine heat wave. And then this crash happened, and sort of, you know, in hindsight, it was clear they were linked, but there hadn't been this explicit link. And so the SSC, here's a quote there, they recommended explicit consideration and documentation of ecosystem and stock assessment status for each stock to aid in identifying stocks of concern. So they just basically said, hey, we need to really bring these things together. Even though we are treating the information together, we're not doing it formally. So we had a working group that formed in response to this and trying to develop, our goal was to develop a consistent approach to recommending ABC reductions. So we came up with these risk tables. I hope you can read this on my screen. It looks like it's really tiny. There's 3 columns. There's assessment related, meeting the model, population dynamics related, and ecosystem related. And on the left are 4 levels of what would be considered concern. So level 1 being normal, all the way up to the extreme concern. And the idea is that we take this format and talk through information that the stock assessment author has that's either related to the model, population dynamics, or the ecosystem. And the stock assessment author sort of evaluates that qualitatively, like what level of concern is this? And so some examples with the assessment model would be, poor fits to data, high levels of uncertainty, or strong retrospective bias. That would be a major concern in the assessment model. For population dynamics, if the stock trends were highly unusual and, the models themselves are population dynamics models, but in some years with some stocks, you get these patterns that just, they're really atypical, and the author knows that the model is not particularly robust to that. So that would be a level 3 major concern. And then for the ecosystem, it ranges from either no apparent environmental or ecosystem concerns up to, level 2 would be some indicators showing adverse signals for the stock, but the pattern's not consistent across indicators. A major concern, level 3, would be multiple indicators showing consistent adverse signals across the same trophic level as the stock, so kind of thinking LME wise, or up and down trophic levels like predators or prey. And then level 4 would be extreme anomalies, highly likely to impact the stock, and the potential for cascading effects on other ecosystem components. And so importantly, I just want to clarify that, so these would be concerns that are not already in the stock assessment model. So there's no double counting. If you've got a severe decline in your recruitment or just your biomass, like the cod spawning stock biomass, that's already accounted for in the stock assessment model in that example. So it wouldn't be listed in the risk table, even though there was a huge decline. If the model is addressing it well, it doesn't go in the risk table. And the information that goes in there is also very specific to the year, because we're talking about annual ABCs. We're only trying to inform that annual ABC. And so these risk tables are not meant to be comprehensive evaluations. That's really what an ESP is. But it's really focused on information that might inform the current ABC. So again, no different to the ongoing process. It's really just about formalizing what had been happening kind of through discussion in the various council committees. And so in 2018, we produced 5 draft risk tables. Here's the example from the Gulf of Alaska cod, where the assessment concerns were considered to be a level 2, substantially increased concerns. Early recruitment estimates are uncertain and sensitive to model assumptions, so that's why it was a level 2 and not level 1. Population dynamics, although the model accounted for the drop in biomass, there were sort of consecutive years of low recruitment, that was considered to be a level 2. And then in the environmental ecosystem considerations in 2018, we actually saw improved foraging conditions relative to the previous few years, but it looked like there was the onset of a new marine heat wave that we ended up seeing in 2019, et cetera. So that was considered level 2. Now, this risk table is separate from what that reduction should be. So this is just the information justifying whether there should be or isn't a reduction. It is not directly linked to how much that reduction is. And so that's definitely a separate step that's being worked on. In this case, the author's recommended ABC was such that the catch would maintain the spawning stock biomass above B20, and that had to do with a stellar sea lion set aside that we have in the Gulf of Alaska, which equated to a 13.6% reduction and a very low ABC because, of course, the stock had crashed and the model was already, the maximum ABC was very low. So we presented these 5 to the council, and they liked them and recommended that they be done for all stocks. There was the request to add a fishery performance column with the same 4 levels of concern. Now, this is not to inform TAC, but this is fishery performance, things that might be indicators of what's going on with the stock that's just different from the other information we have. And the reason that came about is when the cod crashed, there was one particular jig fishery which just was not finding them well before these other fisheries did. And so that could have been a red flag if we had been looking at that. So again, it's fishery performance is reflective of a stock, not to inform the TAC. And so, so now we have, 4 columns of concerns that we just systematically kind of go through. The ESRs typically tend to inform, obviously, the ecosystem column, but sometimes the population dynamics column because we have a lot of recruitment-related indicators. The ESPs inform both of those, as well as also fishery performance because their ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles, so they have a lot more sort of fishery-derived indicators than our LME-based ESRs do. And so just, thinking about the process here, messy spreadsheet, but, how do we do this? How do we coordinate this with the different sources of information? And for at least for the ecosystem column, which I believe is what this ecosystem working group is particularly interested in, not the other 2 columns, we have about 40 stock assessments a year. And what we do is we assign a point of contact from the ESR or ESP to each full stock assessment that's going to be done that year. And we have a few meetings. And so this, I can tell you already, one of the take homes is it really increases collaboration between the stock assessment authors and the ecosystem people. And so the stock assessment lead author is the one who is making the recommendation, and they definitely lead the process. But for the ecosystem column, the ecosystem scientists provide draft text to kind of, inform which level it is. And then the stock assessment author actually has final say. And occasionally we've had stock assessment authors write their own, but in general, I can tell you they're very happy for somebody else who's more familiar with the ecosystem information to draft the text for that. And so these meetings, there's generally a couple each season. Our falls, there's so many stock assessments and ESRs, and time's really tight in the fall. But we tend to have about 2 meetings. And sometimes we group stock assessments where the stocks in question are sort of similar trophically. So large predatory flatfish in the Bering Sea, like arrowtooth flounder, Greenland turbot, and Kamchatka flounder. We tend to group those meetings just to increase efficiency. And we use this framework here to kind of help us get through the information. If there's an ESP, there's already a lot of this information, but we talk about environmental processes, sort of look at prey, look at competitors, especially if there are stocks where they're kind of data poor. We look at, competitors to see what can we infer from either other stocks that occupy similar trophic levels or just our direct competitors, and then predators. And again, this isn't meant to be a comprehensive review of ecosystem concern, interactions with that stock, just again, tailored towards informing the ABC and information that's not addressed in the stock assessment model. But what happens is these qualitative discussions and these sort of qualitative risk levels, they just help document this process. And of course, any reduction that comes out of it certainly has a quantitative impact on the ABC and the TAC in most cases. But again, the reduction itself is a separate system. And at some point, there was discussion early on, well, maybe, if it's a risk level 2, it should equate to a certain amount of reduction. But we quickly were like, no, those are completely separate processes. So just a summary here. So 2018, back to Gulf of Alaska, Pacific cod, the environmental ecosystem considerations were a level 2 of concern. And the author recommended a reduction from max ABC by 13.6%, which was accepted by the SSC. And again, for that particular stock, there's concerns with stellar sea lions, leaving enough for stellar sea lions, that B20. In 2020, for Eastern Bering Sea Pacific cod, the ecosystem risk level was also considered a level 2, but the author in this case recommended no reduction from max ABC, and that was accepted by the council, by the SSC. And so here's a case where, we documented these things going on that might be a concern. So we considered this information. It's now documented, even though there was no reduction. And before risk tables, if these discussions had been happening, which they were happening, we considered all this ecosystem information, but there was no reduction. If there was no reduction, it hardly ever got documented. So we had this big lack of zero. So it's really hard to go back in time and kind of review, well, when were they first considering, heat waves or something like that? Well, if there was no reduction, there often were just no notes of what was actually considered. And then the last example on the right is 2022 for Eastern Bering Sea pollock, where it's considered to be a level 1, like no apparent concerns. Oceanographic conditions had relaxed to near normal. Krill abundances were relatively high. The trends in predator abundances were mixed, but nothing really stood out. The author in this case still recommended a reduction from max ABC of 43.5%, which then went through those 2 levels of review, and the SSC recommended a reduction of 36%. So they reduced the reduction, noting the favorable ecosystem conditions for recruitment. So again, separate processes, but we're just getting a lot more transparency, which is great for our stakeholders, and documentation for future analysis. What are the things that really impacted the management decisions? And so one thing that's really great at having this formalized is now we can summarize what was considered and what was informative. So, our ESRs are each really big documents. And so we've been producing these 4-page, we call them briefs, and that come out in December at the same time as that last council meeting. And they're really they're not for the general public, they're for what we call the council family. So people who are, informed, but they're written in a much more public-friendly manner. And they just sort of summarize, what was the big story that year? Because each ESR is really focused on the year. And on the back, because of risk tables, we can now, in real time, because we draft this at the council meeting and then they get printed, summarize the management uses of the ecosystem information in the ESR. So we can say things like, they considered ecosystem information in 16 full assessments for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. 2 of these assessments cited classified ecosystem dynamics at a risk level of 2, noting substantially increased concerns. And then, you can say like X number of stocks had reductions from max ABC, of which 1 was related, the justification was related to ecosystem concerns. So that's really exciting, like documenting the uptake while, in real time, basically, as you're presenting the ecosystem information. And so I did a quick summary. We're going to do this more formally now that we've had several years of these risk tables. And so here, we started in 2018. We had 5 stock assessments we did this for, and then increased, the next year, 2019, 20, all the way up to last December. And this is just counting up of those stock assessments, how many recorded in their ecosystem column, a level 1. So it went up to, normal conditions, basically nothing to be worried about. And in 2020, like the vast majority of them were considered an ecosystem level of 1. And then an ecosystem level 2 would be that substantially increased concerns. And you can see that that has, changed over time. In 2019, in the Gulf of Alaska, we had another big heat wave that one year. And so many more of the stocks, 7 of them had ecosystem concerns that were elevated out of, 39 to 40 that are done each year. But it's only about 2 to 5 assessments. And this has been consistent throughout the history, even before risk tables, where reductions from max ABC are taken in each year. So you'll only have about 2 to 5 assessments. So the vast majority of our ABCs are just the maximum, but now we have all this documentation. So in 2021, after a couple of years of using this, our SFC asked for we had a workshop, just what have we learned about risk tables? Should we continue with this? Is it working for us? And the overall benefits that we had realized was that, most importantly, it really provides transparency in a consistent framework that, documents concerns that led to a reduction or no reduction. Again, that's what was absent in the past, is we didn't do a good job of documenting when we considered ecosystem information, but the ABC wasn't reduced. And it also, incidentally, as I said, has increased collaboration between our ecosystem scientists and our stock assessment group. And we can see that this qualitative application of data, so all that contextual information, the vast majority of it is highly quantitative, comes from models or surveys, et cetera, these indicators. But the way it's considered contextually, since it's not within the population dynamics model, is qualitative, but it can have a quantitative impact on the catch level. And this also, in Alaska, there's so many things going on that are so different from what has been expected in terms of in the ecosystem. And so these risk tables give us a great place to document, wow, we've seen this giant die-off this year that's bigger than any we've ever seen and hadn't anticipated. And so that gets acknowledged and discussed in light of the stock assessment. Some of the challenges, it's the inconsistencies between risk levels and subsequent reductions. That's been a learning process over the years. We're getting better at that. What to do with bycatch stocks, the non-target ones, stock complexes, very data poor stocks. And sometimes it's difficult to know what information goes into what column because we're trying to be so careful about not double counting. Is it really a population dynamics concern about recruitment, or does that indicate something about the ecosystem, that kind of thing? And this is my last slide. We went through that workshop and the decision was, we're going to keep risk tables. They are really providing a lot of benefits for us. If something else comes along better, we'll adopt that. But, right now we are using them as they were designed. It's mostly unchanged. We reduced the risk levels to 3 from 4. And they're not mandatory for the tier 4 to 6 stocks where we have less information. But if they're not doing them, the author must include a compelling rationale why there's no risk table, because we don't want to lose that opportunity to document those, what I call the 0 cases. So that's what I have. And I'm sorry, I've left very little time for questions.
That's okay. We do have some buffer time. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Stephanie. That was great. So I'm going to give other people a little time to think up their questions by asking the first question. Would you mind going back a couple slides? You had like the years, that one. Yes, thank you.
Great.
Going with the years and the, yeah. So
Yeah.
does that indicate, did you do 39 stocks in your first year, or
So
how many stocks are you doing, sort of adding per year in terms of the risk tables? Or have you only done those 3 species you mentioned earlier?
no. So yeah, I'm sorry. That's the total number. The total is the total number of stock assessments that were full assessments each year. So pretty consistent. They're on different cycles for whether or not they do full or these reduced assessments. But the total number of risk tables you could get, and I'm sorry I didn't add that here, by adding sort of the first and second column. So in 2018, we did 5 risk tables. That was the first year, even though there were 39 stock assessments that were done. And then in 2019, we did, 19 of the stock assessments had risk tables of the 39 stock assessments. And yeah, so apologies. That was just a quick, I actually went into that spreadsheet this morning, like, how many have we actually done, and counted up how many, because I know that it's, not very many where we reduce from maximum ABC, but it was interesting to me that you can see, the years that basically post heat wave, except for 2019, we've had fewer risk tables that have had like a substantially increased concern overall. And this is a quick average because we're averaging across large marine ecosystems. There's really different things going on. But, in 2020, overall, it was pretty average year. And so ones that had been elevated in the past were reduced. So just showing that it's quite flexible because it's about that year, and it's about the information we have for that year and what should be informative for that year's ABC. So it should be flexible if the environment's changing and the information that goes into the stock assessment there's no ecosystem indicators moving into the stock assessment, et cetera. Yeah, does that help?
Yes, thank you. And it's very helpful, and it's impressive that you went from 5 to 24 in just a few years. So
yeah, I mean, that's why, if you're considering this, that's actually why I talked about the coordination and the process of it, because there's a lot of discussion and review and, which has benefits, right? There's increased collaboration, but, it takes time too in a lot of meetings.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to go and manage the questions. I think Andy Lysing was first, and then Kiva Oken is next. Go ahead, Andy.
Hey, Stephanie, how's it going?
Hey, hi, fine, thanks.
Hi. So I'm really interested. So it sounded like the first thing you guys did already is you're going from that 4 levels down to 3 levels. But I'm still curious, even with 3 levels, it's always qualitative a little bit. Could you talk more about how you decide, like, is it level 2 or level 3? And, because again, it's always a, qualitative thing. If you have, do you say, well, we have to have 5 indicators or 2 indicators, or, if one indicator says they're all going to boil alive in the ocean next year, does that get, how do you make those choices? I guess I'm just curious about the process that goes on when you make those the categories.
Yeah, so the difference is, because sometimes you have good information, sometimes you don't. We were trying to, I'm not sure if you guys can read this, but you can have a couple indicators that don't look great, but if you honestly are looking across the rest and they're not showing anything adverse, that's elevated. Whereas like now the final, the level 3 would be like consistently across all these indicators, something really big is happening. We know it's impacting the stock. They might boil. And there has been, it's a lot of group discussion, and there sometimes there's not agreement, but the stock assessment author does have the final say. but we're documenting it. So in the future, if we go back and we're like, wow, we thought these two things we looked at, weren't important. These other things were important. Well, we've learned that, those other two things are very important. And now we know, and we would score that differently, et cetera. So it's a learning process, but because they're big categories, and that's actually why the categories got reduced, because it was really hard to, we were getting people saying like 2.5, things like that. And so we're like, generally no concerns, some things are concerning, but we have to admit other things aren't concerning. And then consistently either, across that whole trophic level or up and down or, in the ecosystem, et cetera. So
can I, just to clarify, so you're the people who are doing the ESR part are sort of writing a little bit of narrative,
yes.
But you're saying the stock assessment person is the person that then gives it that category?
So in the stock assessment itself, they show this table, and then they have those 4 categories, and there's a paragraph or more. It's just really supposed to be a paragraph, but sometimes it can be 3 paragraphs talking about, everything about the stock assessment model, things that they're like, yeah, it's saying this, but I recognize that this retrospective pattern is like bordering on something. Same thing with population dynamics, sort of a, discussion about things that are going on that, in one stock, one year, there was a single dominant year class. And like, it just was really different from other years because that year class was so big. Maybe the model doesn't handle that totally well. And then in the ecosystem, typically the ecosystem people provide those paragraphs, usually like 1 per category. Like, what do we know about oceanographic conditions that might be impacting the stock this year that aren't accounted for in the model already? Because some have, mortality blocks based on temperature or something like that. Same thing with prey, competitors, and then predators. So it's like 4 paragraphs of information. And at the bottom is the recommendation. 1, 2, or 3.
Okay, thank you. Kiva, followed by Mary Hunsaker.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. That was a really interesting talk. Oh, let me move this thing. Okay. I have 2 questions. I guess my first question is, what do you do when the ecosystem conditions indicate above average productivity for the stock?
Yeah, that's a good question because it's reducing from maximum ABC, right? It's a one-way trip. So that right now, nothing. It just we write it up. It's a level 1, and we write, things actually look really great and maybe better. But because of the way right now, they can't recommend above a maximum ABC. But we're documenting that, and there's discussions about, our OY caps, like should those, anyway, lots of ongoing research. But yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that because it really is a one-way trip. But it also gives us a way to like really provide support, like, yes, maximum ABC should be great.
And is that the MSA that's limiting, or is it specific to the region, the Magnus and Siemens? Is that?
Yeah, well, so some of that, like the tier level of the stock is in the fisheries management plan, like reflects the amount of information, the amount of uncertainty, like kind of already in this buffer from overfishing to ABC. And so, yeah, it's because of that. It would be a bigger change. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And then my other question was, these species, their life histories are really variable. And so some species are really built to weather years of poor conditions, whereas others are not. Or I guess they all are, but they do it in different ways. And so how do you, is that something that like the stock assessment author considers when they're making the recommendation, or how does that come in? Because like, you're not going to expect, insane rockfish recruitment every year.
Yeah, well, that's all part of that discussion, which is so fabulous. Like, it's really increased that collaboration. So, we had that big marine heat wave. Well, why was it cod that crashed? Well, cod, they have these growth rates, they grow so fast. Sablefish, yeah, they live 100 years. They just can weather those years. It's not quite the same thing. So this is exactly why you can't just throw in a marine heat wave indicator, because it impacts the different stocks differently. Like it actually is beneficial to some and not, and so that goes into all that discussion in that, documentation of why, even though 2019 was this really big heat wave, we expected the impact to be greater on cod than we did on sablefish, et cetera. So that's where the flexibility comes in, and that knowledge, that stock specific to that ABC. So yeah, I guess the answer to your question is the ecosystem scientists are supposed to provide that information.
No, but that's like helpful context. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And then I think after Mary, we're going to cut this off and move on to Corey's presentation.
I can't hear you.
Sorry. Hi, Stephanie. Thanks for that great presentation. I had a question going back to one of your challenges, and I may have missed this, but when you were talking about the inconsistencies between risk levels and subsequent reductions or lack thereof, and I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more. And I'm wondering if that inconsistency is a result from the makeup of the group and the stock assessment scientists that are creating the risk table, or is it at the council level? And also if you see different groups weighting, for example, ecosystem information and uncertainty differently than other groups.
Yeah, so that is just historically has been the case. And in a way, creating these risk tables was a way to kind of like air our dirty laundry, because in the past, it wasn't possible to make those comparisons. Like, hey, here they have, in this stock assessment, they had these concerns and they didn't make a reduction. But in this stock, or there was a certain concern, they made a certain reduction. But in this other stock assessment, same concern, but a very different reduction. The only people who could have really tracked that before were people that were super involved, like, really tracking each stock assessment. And now with risk tables, it's really easy for our stakeholders to say, hey, why is that reduction for max ABC so big in that stock, whereas over here it's only this? So it was that, opening yourself up to that level of transparency. There was some pain early on, but in the long run, it's helped us because it is easier to inform those questions. Like, why is it so different? So the reason it's historically been so different, that wasn't really clear until we did this. I mean, people knew, but it wasn't easy to compare across all the 40 stock assessments, was for different individual reasons that kind of developed within that stock assessment. And so sometimes if there was there's like this stair step option with some stocks where they had a reduced ABC, and then the next year they did a stair step, like they didn't want to change it that much from the previous one, but basically it was like the history within each stock assessment was quite different. And the factors that influence that, like I mentioned that example with Gulf of Alaska, Pacific cod has the stellar sea lion set aside. And so, the reductions there happened when they might not have been another stock because there wasn't that issue of maintaining, staying above B20 or, something like that. So it's that that history was very specific to that stock assessment model over time and the issues they dealt with, that now we can easily compare across and ask those questions. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank Stephanie again for her time. I was particularly grateful to have her agree to speak with us because, although she is a public employee, she's wholly owned by the North Pacific Fishery Management Council and is with the Alaska Fishery Science Center. And so it's just lovely of you to come and talk with us. And thank you so much for spending some of your morning with us.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Apologies for going on too long, and I'm happy to answer more questions via email.
Okay. Thanks, Steph. Okay, so while we get Dr. Corey Green up and going and make sure that Corey is able to use the presentation feature, I'm going to just, for a moment before handing the microphone over to Tommy to chair, I think so first, Jessica Watson, thank you so much for taking notes during the last conversation. EWG members, if you are not sharing today, please, who is going to be taking notes during Corey Green's presentation? Because I think it's helpful, we don't just need to know what he's saying verbatim, but what's happening in your minds as you're listening to that. So is there someone on the EWG who will volunteer to take notes? Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate that. Okay, Tommy and Corey, take it away, and let's have a test from Corey on microphone and presentation.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it sounds good.
All right, great. Let's see if I can share the screen. So I was having some instability with my computer. I'm not sure what's going on, so I'm going to share this as a PDF. And so there was some minor animations I put in that won't be reflected in my presentation, but it's not a big deal. All right, can you see that?
Yeah, it looks good.
All right, so I'm going to present a high-level discussion of the salmon stoplight charts and harvest management. And I'd like to just emphasize that I've been really close to some of these stoplight charts, but not all of them by any means. And so I'm really glad to see Brian Burke, Will Satterthwaite, and Chris Harvey on the line as well to keep me honest if I go astray. And so what I've been asked to do, let's see if this works. Yes, this is going to be delayed. Hold on a sec. You see that? Okay. Basically, I was asked to address 3 points. These are on the top of the screen as bullets. And so how and when are stoplight tables used in the salmon management process? Once the salmon season discussions begin at PFMC, how are the stoplight tables part of those discussions? And then are they made available to the US-Canada preseason? And I added another one. I want to start off with just a general overview of these stoplight charts so we're all on the same page as what we're talking about. And so just a nutshell answer to these questions. Basically, I would say that stoplight charts have only recently been considered for use specifically in the salmon management process. And I would say current efforts are moving from a more retrospective approach with these stoplight charts and the data that go into them more towards risk assessment as time goes on. All right, so I mean, this is a really good opportunity from the perspective of what the EWG is doing to inform some of these considerations, not only for the stocks you pick, but just for the process of risk assessment in general. Okay, so I'm going to go through these 3 stoplight charts as quickly as I can. They're in the ESR. There's been a lot of work done on them, so I don't want to spend too much time, but just to give you a brief sense of what they are. To start out, this is the oldest one. This is the ocean ecosystem indicator for juvenile salmon off Washington and Oregon, based on work that the Northwest Fisheries Science Center does. And essentially, Brian Burke and his team has put together these indicators at different geographical scales, ranging from local biological to climate and atmospheric. And within each of these cells you see here is basically a year summary indicating really good conditions, so to speak, in blue, and really poor conditions in red. And then all that yellow you see there is basically around +1 or -1 standard deviation of the average conditions. And so you get a sense when you look across all these indicators how this situation is shaping up for that year class that's entering the ocean. And the highlighted in blue over there was one interesting finding from the recent years was that there was a disjunct between what the large-scale climate indicators were saying and what local physical indicators were saying. The green and blue versus the orange. Okay, so a second set of indicators are indicators of productivity for the Sacramento River Fall Chinook stock, and this was based on outcome of some life cycle modeling that was done by the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, looking at various correlates of productivity, and basically 4 indicators rose to the top. That was the spawning escapement, incubation temperature, February median flow, and then seabird predation index. And basically what is shown here is for the last few years, how those indicators are shaping up in terms of relative to reference points. So for example, there's a reference point for spawning escapement for Sacramento River, so it compares that. There's a reference point for what incubation temperature should be, and so forth. And so this really tracking what's going on for the year associated with the main return year, which is age 3-year-olds, and that's why those boxes are highlighted, indicating that for 2023, very poor situation was indicated. Low spawning escapement, poor incubation temperature, very low flow, and so that was one way to qualitatively assess the situation for Sacramento River Fall Run. And then the third set of indicators are these habitat indicators, which were put together by the Habitat Committee after some requests by the Salmon Technical Committee to provide a review of non-fishing impacts to stocks which were in rebuilding plans. And so this was the idea, put together habitat-related indicators associated with different life stages and address them for multiple years, and then get as long a time series and a time series in which that was updatable and had leading indicators, so that so basically you could have an eye toward forecasting and further council engagement. And so it's just like the ocean indicators, each of those boxes summarizes a year for a particular indicator. And in this case, it's associated with the brood year. And then again, the blue indicates really good conditions. Red equals really bad conditions, and then those yellows are within 1 or 2, within 1 or below 1 standard deviation. Also notice that there's a number of gray boxes here. Those are lack of data. And we have noticed sort of an increasing trend in some of these indicators that they are either not being reported anymore, or they're difficult to report. And so there's some of those have cropped up in the most recent year of compiling these data sets. All right, so just to summarize the comparison of these three, we have the ocean indicators, and I should point out that they have different origins. So the ocean indicators really developed based on research on marine survival and trying to understand what those conditions were for returns. And now their current role in salmon management right now, I think, is largely focused on stock forecasts for Chinook and coho along the coast of Oregon and Washington. And then we have the Central Valley Fall Run Chinook. That origin was based on the life cycle model. And right now there's qualitative reporting in the ESR. And finally, we have these habitat indicators for 3 California Chinook salmon stocks. And there's origin was really directly associated with council process to produce these non-fishing impacts related to rebuilding plans. And as I'll go into in a little bit, it is now moving more toward a qualitative risk assessment. And so it's worth keeping in mind with sort of the timing of these reporting of indicators, how that matches up with the salmon management process, which I'll get to in a second. But basically, those ocean indicators are completed and on the website in November to December timeframe. Central Valley Fall Run is really tied to the ESR, although it's conceivably available as early as December. And then those habitat indicators, most indicators are available by December, but there are some which are harder to get information for. And as I said, there's been some degradation in the reporting of those over time. Okay, so the next question that I was asked to address was how and when are stoplight charts used in the salmon management process. And so this graphic just gives you a sense of the complexities of how salmon management works in the PFMC world. And it's worth noting that it's a larger than just PFMC. Salmon move across boundaries, and as a result, there's a lot of work associated with the Pacific Salmon Treaty and making sure that harvest levels are meet the obligations of those treaties. And so basically the Pacific Salmon Commission actually starts with a fall meeting that's mostly a retrospective meeting that gives you a sense of how things were the previous years. And the activity really ramps up in this December to February timeframe, when a lot of this discussion happens about estimating what each stock abundance is likely to be. And that is a sort of two-way process. There's information that the Pacific Salmon Commission provides, but there's also local groups, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, for example, which provides information to models that the Pacific Salmon Commission runs to inform harvest, likely harvest, which goes back into this estimation, and then further into determining the number of salmon to harvest, that second stage. And then there's a sort of a feedback as well at that second stage. Once the PFMC decides what those harvest rates should be, then that goes back to the Pacific Salmon Commission as sort of feedback and make sure these treaty obligations and ESA requirements are met across boundaries. And so where would stoplight charts best fit into this whole process? I'll just focus on the Pacific Salmon management process right now. There's sort of two stages. There's the first initial stage at which you make an estimate for each stock, and that's where stoplight charts have been generally used right now. And so there's that qualitative risk assessments, what's the stock likely to look like, and then there's actually efforts to forecast what adult returns will be like. And those have incorporated, for example, the ocean indicators for, say, Lower Columbia River coho, and some other stocks as well. There's also the opportunity to think about these stoplight charts in the context of uncertainty with respect to harvest. And that is, I would say, less been an approach quite yet. I mean, there's, with respect to that qualitative risk assessment, there has been some of that, but much of it is really focused on uncertainty in the actual numbers of fish. But I point out here that there is this potential to take this approach and use it for harvest management, particularly in harvest control rules. And one example which exists within the forecasting suite that is used for various stocks is the Oregon coho harvest control rule. And if you basically, this graphic really associates what the impact rates of Oregon coho should be from commercial fishing based on what the parent spawners would be and what the forecast marine survival would be. And so the parent spawners ranges from critical to high, forecast ranges from very low to high. And basically you have what actual numbers in those boxes ranging from essentially 0 to 35%. And essentially categories of harvest, or a stoplight chart in its own respect, that is informed by various indicators. The parent spawners are based on adult returns and inferences from models of adult returns and smolt monitoring. And then that forecast marine survival is also based on a number of different indicators using multi-model inference and a suite of climate indicators. And so this is a slightly different approach than a lot of what the other harvest control rules entail, but it is perhaps slightly more attuned to this kind of approach of using ecosystem indicators and risk assessment. Right, so I had this further question: how are the stoplight tables part of the salmon management discussions? And so here I wanted to address that from the perspective of the habitat indicators, which would have together by the Habitat Committee. And just to give you a sense of how these indicators have evolved from a retrospective approach to more of a risk assessment approach. So they were initially developed, again, as a request from the Salmon Technical Committee to help determine non-fishing impacts associated with rebuilding plans for two stocks, Sacramento Fall Run Chinook and Klamath River Fall Run Chinook. And so we put a lot of time thinking about what these indicators should be, how they could be updated, and so forth. But we also wanted to think about sort of how they might be used in the future. And so here's where we actually try to provide indicators which could be updated in a timely process to inform risk management and also council engagement. And the second point is the bread and butter of the Habitat Committee. It's about sort of identifying habitat issues of concern and then bringing those to the attention of the council. And the council comes back sometimes and asks, well, we need an agency to be informed about this from our perspective. And so the Habitat Committee writes a letter. And so that's a very different approach to management than some of the harvest management policies, but it nevertheless is an important piece to the entire council operations. And so with developing these indicators, we went through this process. A couple of interesting aspects emerged. One, I think, thing which caught Noah's eye was that basically the combination of below average conditions for freshwater and marine conditions were associated with these critical years in which these rebuilding plans kicked into place. And so it's that cumulative effects of multiple poor or even relatively poor conditions in freshwater and marine that I think are sort of the are basically telling us that there's poor likely returns for fish in the future. And so that's where this risk management probably can be most useful. And so that inspired, I think, NOAA to make a request in 2022 to include Central Valley Spring Chinook as well, because that assessment is particularly poor. And so additional indicators such as habitat indicators were deemed to be useful for making a better risk assessment for the coming year. And so we completed that, had draft indicators by November, and so that could be used in the in a risk assessment approach, and it was very qualitative. Basically, we looked at the two most recent years shown in blue on the right there and asked whether conditions were looking poor for not only the returning year class of this year, which probably is not associated with high harvest just because of the timing, but also the next years, which is probably definitely associated in time and space with harvest. And so that combination really pointed toward relatively poor conditions for spring run. In addition, Klamath Run indicators were relatively poor, and Sacramento fall run indicators were relatively poor. And so the combination of all those together, I think, helped make a strong case, in addition to many other arguments for the closure of the fishery that year. And so as I just want to emphasize that these indicators are finalized in January, reported to the ESR in March on an annual basis. And again, some of those indicators are really dependent upon reporting on websites and by various people. And so that has tended to drag at times. And so you can see on the left that we've lost one indicator, that's the Marine Predation Index. We've had to delay reporting of one indicator, that's survival, freshwater survival for fall run fish. those kinds of things crop up as time has gone on, and these indicators are being reported, but with lower staff. Okay, so I had a question about salmon stoplight charts and transboundary management. And so basically the issue is, can these be reported, and are these being reported in the context of Pacific Salmon Commission coordination? And so the answer is generally, I would say the situation is pretty good. First, these ocean indicator are well socialized in the salmon ecology world, for example, through the salmon ocean ecology meetings, but also many other informal meetings as well. And they're available, obviously, for use by Pacific salmon technical committees, and, as I pointed out before, already inform forecasts of some stocks. And finally, they're available pretty much straightforwardly on the website, and efforts are underway right now for a more formalized approach for improving data sharing between NOAA and DFO counterparts. So I think the situation is at least conducive to their use, and the main question is whether there's a decision to use those in a risk assessment approach. So all this is to say, just 4 points from my own perspective about how to improve the use of stoplight charts in salmon management. First, better timing and better presentation. These are sort of really minor tweaks that we can do to improve the situation. The better timing facilitates those to be used either in a forecasting approach or more qualitative risk assessment. Better presentation might help emphasize those above average and below average situations. And when you get a cumulative below average situation is where you might be wanting to be more conservative in your risk assessment. And then a whole set of questions about better tuning of indicators to specific salmon stocks. And some of the questions we might be asking there are which stocks would benefit most from suites of indicators. What suites of indicators should those be? Should indicators be weighted for specific stocks? And which indicators have those strongest correlates with productivity? And so just to make a plug, in July, Chris Harvey has organized a workshop to deal with this for our stoplight indicators. And so we're going to dive under the hood for some of these questions to address it a little better. And finally, it's worth emphasizing that there are multiple pathways in the council engagement process. There's the retrospective approach that I emphasized, sort of that via review through rebuilding plans. There's the harvest management approach, directly thinking about current and future harvest rates, dealing with forecasting, risk assessment, and potentially harvest control. And finally, there's the documentation for highlighting non-fisheries management issues. And this is really to inform basically consultations and letter writing that the council does to improve salmon conditions to other agencies. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Corey. And before I pass it over, I think I saw Elliot's hand flash up in record time. Just want to comment as well, in addition to the stoplight, one of the challenges is that for salmon, the forecasts are done for a run-by-run basis, with some runs having more or less data, some are already including some environmental data and some aren't. So there's a lot that happens before this even approaches council floor. But now if I can figure out how to view the hands. Go ahead, Elliot.
Yeah, Tommy, can I just address that for a second? The habitat indicators were developed for the spring run to address that very issue, is that the stock was somewhat data poor, and the habitat indicators were offered an alternative approach to get at sort of a similar question.
Yeah, go ahead, Elliot.
Just a quick question for me, specifically for your example in following up on what Steph Sador presented. if this approach, the stoplight, can directly affect harvest control rules potentially, is there an opportunity for positive benefits or increasing of quota, or is it also similar to the risk table approach, always a decreasing, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I can only speak to my understanding of the existing harvest control rule, and that would be for Oregon Coho. So yes, in that situation, you might have a more liberal harvest control rule if your suite of abiotic ocean indicators forecasted high marine survival.
Oh, thank you. Don?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. My experience on the SAS with season setting is we really have a very distinct geographic point north and south of Falcon. I think that has to be captured in our risk tables. We have two different drivers this year, obviously, between no fishing south of Falcon for Chinook and fishing for them north of Falcon. So that leads me to say we need to factor that in. And then we look at a stock by stock analysis north of Falcon because we have subquota areas that are critical to our season setting process. So I think that needs to be given some consideration in how we move forward on these tables. And then, with north of Falcon, we need probably better to capture the history data from the Columbia Snake River Basin, because that seems to be one of the driving regions for our numbers of fish we're managing to. So that makes freshwater indicators maybe different in California, different in Oregon and Washington and Idaho. Again, these factors should be looked at, in my opinion.
Thanks for that comment, Don. And you reminded me that of one important little factoid about the ocean ecology indicators, which really address stocks in Oregon and Washington as they affect the North Falcon process potentially. But the indicators are not particularly good for another group of fish, and that's those in Puget Sound. And so the WDFW has compared models incorporating forecast models, I should say, incorporating some of these ocean indicators. And while they perform well for coastal stocks, they do not perform well for Puget Sound stocks. And so getting at your point about complexity and which species are sensitive to which indicators, I think it's important to think carefully about sort of which stocks are really needing these indicators. And secondly, how those suites of indicators would be put together or weighted.
I think it'd be a very interesting result. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Any more questions for Corey, or do we want to? If not, I can pass back over. Go ahead, Yvonne.
So, thank you, Corey. This is silly of me, but I hadn't even thought about the benefit of these indicators to the Habitat Committee and sort of commenting letters and having more of a sort of scientific background that you can present to other agencies when you're writing these letters of comments. So I wanted to really thank you for bringing that in and for thinking about all of the different ways that these indicators and these tables can be used in the council process, and draw the attention of other folks on the line to both Appendix J in this year's Ecosystem Status Report and the recording of the Ecosystem Subcommittee, because you and Brian Burke and others did a great job presenting last year on all of this, and it goes into a lot of detail about, sort of that looking under the hood of what the different colors mean. And so I just wanted to check with you again on this last slide here. You have better timing to facilitate forecasting and qualitative risk assessment. there's just, these stoplight tables are so big and there's so much information in them. Is that even possible for the agency to improve the timing? I mean, I guess it's always possible, but is the data coming in at a time that it can be turned around fast enough to get into the process earlier, or what do you think are some of the challenges of improving the timing of bringing the information into the sort of public process?
So I'm going to look to Brian Burke to correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that with respect to the salmon ocean indicators, the timing is pretty well set up for forecasting and qualitative risk assessment. I would say that these other suites of indicators could probably do, we could probably do a better job of at least providing drafts ahead of time of, say, some key indicators, which are well reported. So, for example, USGS monitors flow on a real-time basis, and so that data is readily acceptable and accessible for putting into these suites of indicators. But so basically you might have a setup where you have draft set of indicators and then a final set reported in the ASR. And in that respect would be more fitting of the timing as stocks are assessed and harvest levels are estimated.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure that as with things like timing and details on different stocks and tables and whatnot, we'll just have to check with you and with Brian and the centers as we go along, because it'll be too much. But I'll let, it looks like Don Vernon raised his blue hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate. The pre-season 1 report, which is put together prior to our March meetings, is when that information has to be assessed and evaluated. And I think the slide showed the timing correctly that were provided earlier.
Should I go early? Do you want me to show that again?
Yeah, I think that slide right there shows that's the key part, because in that December, February timeframe, when we do the estimation for each stock, that's when it needs to be looked at to say, do we have a risk problem? Do we not have a risk problem? Because once we start saying towards March, we're seeing numbers for allowable catch and other factors that drive the process of setting season plans. And it's pretty hard to back up at that point because timing is so limited. We meet once and everything goes out to the public after that meeting in March.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Thank you so much, Corey, for coming and talking with us. And I'm sorry, Tommy, I've sort of taken over. Wanted to just check in and see if, Tommy, you have any further questions or comments?
No, I'm good for now. I think we've covered most things.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Corey. We really appreciate you coming to talk with us and doing a little cross collaboration, Habitat Committee and Ecosystem Workgroup. It was super helpful to have you come and talk to us. I feel like, for me at any rate, I'm not as deeply into the salmon process as a lot of other people, and it just helps to have the infusion of your great salmon ideas and better understanding of what's going on in that world. So thank you again for coming and talking with us.
Yeah, Yvonne, thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, and like I said to everyone, if you want to really get a deep dive, then I have to say, although I attended the ecosystem subcommittee meeting last September, I got more out of it when my brain was ready to get more out of it by listening to the recording. So I just would urge you, if you really want to understand what's going on and what they're thinking about, that is a great recording to listen to. So thank you so much, Corey. So So now it is 11:30, and what we have on the schedule for the period of 11:15 to 12 is a discussion of stoplight tables versus risk tables. And I wanted to particularly ask the people on the call, Jamil and Elliot certainly, and then Andy Lysing and Chris Harvey, if you're on and you want to weigh in, to talk a little bit about this question of whether we need one to do the other, whether we can do both, what is sort of, any sort of impressions about the utility of stoplight tables versus risk tables. And if we could, and if folks are willing, if this conversation doesn't take too long, maybe we'll take a little break before noon. So let's see. What are the feelings of the folks who are most deeply involved in the integrated ecosystem assessment? What are your feelings about using stoplight tables versus risk tables, and whether we need to get one going to do the other and that sort of thing? Go ahead, Elliot, and please just raise your blue hands.
Just quickly, I do think that both seem like they are independent and useful. One of the main takeaways I had, particularly given some of Corey's answers, was the stoplight tables may be more data intensive and may suffer more from loss of data issues. So that's just to me a consideration. But I don't. Just to reiterate about this initiative, as part of the goals was to identify multiple potential on-ramps, which Steph's talks and Corey's talks do well.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Jamil.
Thanks, Yvonne, and yeah, thanks, Corey, for that presentation. My thought is that the stoplight tables are one way we could evaluate the climate and ecosystem information that then feeds into a risk table where we make a determination about whether ecosystem conditions are favorable, neutral, or unfavorable, but they're not the only pathway to get there.
Okay, so then in Stephanie's example, maybe one way of thinking about it, and I'm not suggesting that we need to start developing groundfish stoplight tables, but maybe if you have a stock assessor who's wondering about, how to sort of provide draft information for the risk tables, the stock assessor would look at the stoplight tables for that species or species group, and then that would feed into their information that they're providing in the stock assessment or as the appendix to the stock assessment, and then it later gets checked in a risk table, or how would that work? And then I think, Mary, did you have a question next or a comment next?
Sorry, no, I was pressing the wrong button, but I agree with what you've said and with Jamil's comment as well.
Okay, let's see, Kiva, and then I see, Kiva, go ahead and speak, and I see some stuff going on in the chat. And Michelle and Tim, if you want to ask questions, you can go ahead and raise your hands.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Kiva.
I definitely agree with what others have said about these two approaches not being mutually exclusive. One thing that I really heard Stephanie sort of emphasizing was that one of the benefits was like the discussion between the assessment scientists and the ecosystem scientists that was just sort of built into the structure of the assessment process. So I can yell until the cows come home that the assessment team should be reading the ESR every year, but we're not going to. And or not everyone is not going to read the ESR every year, and not everybody is going to attend the ESR presentation every year. But if we could just normalize like a 1 to 2 hour meeting with it doesn't have to be an onerous thing, but I think just normalizing a meeting with every assessment team and an ecosystem scientist every year could be really beneficial. And the other thing is, at least, my bias is obviously groundfish, and I'm struggling to see how this works with our assessment process, where we're not assessing most populations every year. Because in that way, like, what the ecosystem is doing the year the assessment is done is sort of an arbitrary year. And that was sort of why I was getting at the life history stuff. It's part of the reason we don't assess these species terribly, some of these species super often, is because their populations change on much slower timescales. So that I'm still wrapping my head around that, and I don't know what the solution is.
That's great, Kiva. I actually was guessing that's what you were thinking when you asked that question, Stephanie. So thank you for following up. Okay, are there any other blue hands up? I see there's questions in the chat. If you've asked, let's see. Okay, Tim Copeland, Michelle Conrad, or Chris Harvey, do you want to ask a question? Go ahead and unmute yourself if you do.
I don't have a question, more as a comment, which is that I think this is just the things that other folks have already touched on, which is what Kiva was talking about. This the capturing that discussion and translating the information that's in the stoplight chart into something that's going to affect management somehow.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that's, sort of always the challenge risk. There's just so much information and it's coming in a lot of different ways. How do you, quickly boil that down? And something that I thought that was interesting that Stephanie said that caught my ear was don't create too many levels, because then you get into this argument of like, looking for precision where there really isn't any. And so, good, bad, regular is sort of, that may be all that our brains can deal with. So think about that, don't pretend that there's a lot of precision where there isn't. Okay, Michelle, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? And if you're having trouble unmuting, let me know. And Kit, if you could just make sure that it's possible for her to unmute, that would be great. And actually, I don't. Okay, it looks like she's not participating right now, or maybe she had to sign off. Chris Harvey, did you have a comment or question or some enlightenment you wanted to share with us?
Well, so I mentioned in the comments that it seems like the risk table, the stoplight tables are a pathway of information to risk tables, and the reverse might not be true. And the risk tables would also be entry points for other information that could come, let's say, from ecosystem models or other things that don't necessarily find their way into a stoplight table either. So the risk table does sound to me like it's the downstream point, which is fine. I would think that if we were going to try to get to analyzing stoplight tables in such a way that there was at least some kind of qualitative fulcrums for making or for giving advice, that this combination of green, orange, and red squares means level 1, 2, or 3, and we're doing that on an individual stock-based stoplight for, like, say, salmon stocks, that would get just extraordinarily messy and might never leave the station. Whereas, like you point out, with the simplicity of the risk tables, it does feel like a lot of that simplification has been made without the implied precision that might come with it. So I second your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. So let's see. I'm gonna just read out Michelle Conrad's comment and then see if we have any reactions to that. Let's see. But I think, Michelle, that maybe what Chris just said might have answered your question. Let's see, understanding how the stoplight tables translate into risk. In her opinion, risk tables are more specific. They provide a means to document what was considered and what the conclusions were relative to risk to the stock. And Chris, I'm going to let you reply or not. And then Tommy also has his blue hand raised.
Sorry, this isn't a reply to Michelle's. I wanted to just mention one more thing, though, that one of the really nice things about stoplight tables, I think, is that it allows, like Corey displayed, it allows you to look across different life history stages. So part of the funneling process of information that could end up in a risk table is the ability that stoplight tables provide you to look at discrete life history stages that you believe are significant to overall population productivity. And so even if you weren't necessarily going to use the stoplight tables as your decision-making kind of traction, I do like the idea that was mentioned earlier about them being complementary and not mutually exclusive at all. In fact, really helpful counterparts in a decision-making process like this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Tommy.
I guess kind of keeping with the current theme and maybe going at it from a different angle. In my mind, the risk table versus stoplight would be the difference between providing information to be reviewed versus something that would have a direct implication on like policy or management decisions. And whereas stoplight tables, you can share information, the risk tables would probably need to have some type of internal expert review, like the SSC and the management teams, on what was put forth there or anything in a risk table. So whereas typically the IEA team shares the stoplight tables are shared, but they're not internally reviewed and agreed on. So that could be a distinction of when does things move from technical experts to policy into the policy realm, and that kind of that defining line.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's a helpful distinction, and I appreciate that, like reviewed versus not reviewed. Not that the stoplight tables are unreviewed, but it's not sort of crunched through the public process. Okay, good. Let's see. So, any other questions, comments from anyone? If you're on the call at all, you are welcome to raise your hand and speak up. Let's see. Jamil, go ahead, and then Gwei Kirchner.
Thanks, Yvonne. I was just really struck by the value of Corey's infographic on the timing of different management decisions for salmon and how valuable that is. And we have some text along those lines in our report for the March council meeting in the briefing book. But the other thing that I was struck by was that his emphasis on multiple on-ramps. And I think those two things really kind of go together. Like, I was thinking that in Stephanie's presentation with the focus on groundfish, if we then bring that over to our coast and think about it as leading to advice that modifies the conclusions of an assessment, with the way that P-STAR works and so forth, the climate and ecosystem information is just going to provide marginal influence overall, but there may be concern that's more than marginal within the council family around climate and ecosystem conditions for any variety of reasons. And so I was just wanting to just put a note as we think about stoplight tables and risk classification, and we may talk about this more on Wednesday, how that information gets used, and thinking back to Corey's presentation about the idea of multiple on-ramps seems really beneficial.
Okay, thanks, Jamil. Yeah, I agree. I sort of, you never know what you're going to hear that, oh, wait a minute, I forgot that it could be useful elsewhere. So, okay, go ahead, Gray.
Thanks, Yvonne. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, this has been really helpful. I really appreciate the 2 presentations and just generating that thought. And I guess the thought that I would add is, looking at the different fish species, different life histories, different levels of data availability, different needs, I'm wondering if it might be useful to think about what is there a process that would be able to lead you towards identifying one tool over another for a particular species, right? Because I think just like what we saw from the risk table presentation and from Corey's presentation on salmon, like those tools aren't necessarily going to fit every species. It's not a one size fits all. So how would we identify what tool is most useful for the species and how it might be used for that species?
Thanks, Gway. That's a good question and comment. And sometimes I think that is just like the answer to that might just be what information is available. What kind of, can we support it data wise or not? But yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Any questions, comments, thoughts on this issue? And then if there's something else, some other something, a 1 or 2 page something that you think would be better than a stoplight table or a risk table that you want to mention or throw out there, we could also think about that. And we can also think about it later on. We don't have to have brilliant ideas all now.
I think Andy's comment in the chat is kind of and repeating largely someone else said, but I mean, to take the stoplight and turn it into information, experts have to use words to do it, right? And explain it, and so it's hard for just to look at a stoplight chart for a non-expert and go, oh yeah, well those colors are nice, but someone please explain it. Which maybe goes back to what Kiva said. I mean, a lot of the values in the discussion between the assessment folks and others, and the ecosystem people.
Thanks, Corey. Go ahead, Tommy.
Oh yeah, just on the other things to consider is, I guess something I brought up in emails, and this would be for future consideration, but the risk table kind of lends itself to the, at least in my mind, from what I've seen, lends itself to the kind of the P-star level of management, where you are, assigning risk and raising or lowering your catch based on that. And that may not be the best for all fisheries. And some other things where information could be useful is for like in-season adjustments, and I don't know, things that I'm not aware of, but just want to be aware that not try to, as we move forward with this, it'd probably be this time next year even, of just trying to keep a broad picture so we can think of other tools or levels of interaction.
Good. Thank you, Tommy. That's helpful. I agree. Okay, Don Vernon, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a quick thought to the last person who spoke. You may want to define where you want to stop the process, because we go stoplight tables, risk tables, then you could go into risk management, risk assessment, which all becomes more and more data intensive and time required. And so that might be a suggestion to define your endpoint.
Thank you. That is just a great piece of wisdom for this group, and for for all of us in general, there's got to be an endpoint. There's got to be, these management processes have deadlines that have to be met. And sometimes you just got to roll with the best information all the time you have to roll with the best information that you have at the time. So we just have to figure out how to bring that information in and not, keep looking. Well, you can always keep looking for new and better information, but you got to be satisfied at some time. So, okay, so I don't want to, if other people have urgent thoughts or concerns or great ideas that they want to share, I don't want to cut that off, but I do want to give us a chance to actually, shut down for 10, 15 minutes and take a break before we come back and have conversation about something different. So, does anyone else have anything that they want to add to the current conversation on just like reflecting back on what we've talked about this morning and what we heard from Stephanie and Corey, and the use of these different tools in our management process? Okay, I don't see any hands, but I'm also having a little trouble with moving my mouse around right now. Okay, so I have 11:53 and we did have a lunch break in here, didn't we, Kit? Because it looks like we're not on to species selection criteria until 12:30.
Yeah, excuse me, yeah.
Okay.
And for that, I think you had originally lined out actually a lunch break, but
okay.
I just
all right.
indicated it by the time gap.
Okay, sorry. I was worried we had to get back on by noon, and was thinking we didn't have a chance to decompress. So we're okay. All right, phew. That's better. All right. Well, thank you, Kit, for taking care of us and for making sure that we have a lunch break. All right, with that, so I apologize for rushing everyone through, and I will just ask again more slowly. Does anyone else have any final questions or concerns on risk tables versus stoplight tables? And I see appreciation for the lunch break. Let's see. Oh, that is an interesting question, Andy asks. Andrew Lysing asks, would it ever be useful to go back and try to create risk tables of past years to see if they make any sense or would have been helpful? That is an interesting thought. And then Tommy says, agreed, hindcasting would be a good test. I don't know. Go ahead, Jamil, and let's think about whether that's something we can do. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to respond to that, and then to prepare Elliot, ask him for something. So, so I think that's a great idea, Andy. And in particular, through some internal NIMS funding, we are hopeful to bring on somebody in the fall that will be supporting this initiative at the Northwest Center, and that could be the focus of a good research project, something that Kiva and others would be responsible for deciding upon, but I'll only say that it would be a slower burn than the timeline we're on for right now for like getting to a pilot evaluation for at least one stock, but very useful. So the second thing I was going to bring up was this notion of getting from stoplights to risk, and ask Elliot or someone else who might be on the call who's familiar with what happened with the California herring example to talk about how they developed stoplights and then determined how to classify risk in that context. And before I cede the floor, which is what I want to do, is just say that to me there's a distinction between the stoplight, like and risk, which has been discussed by Michelle, Andy, Chris, and others. But then also, given risk, what you do with that information in the harvest setting process. So it just kind of like, I'm creating like 3 steps rather than out of 1. Okay, Elliot, do you mind just giving a brief overview about that herring situation?
Yep. Happy to. I mean, I will say I know it more from the state side as I was part of the review there than how it was actually implemented in the council. But I do know that, the goal was to bring in ecosystem information in very similar to the salmon stoplight that was presented, but more of a heuristic approach. So this would be based on the CCIA information, how good are alternative forage species like small pelagic anchovy sardine, juvenile groundfish, rockfish hake, invertebrates, market squid and krill. So if all of the forage are down, that might again institute more safety or a more conservatism in setting the quota. And I will say that the table 6 of that paper, we did actually set or conduct a hindcast to see how often there would have been a kind of rounding down of quota or a movement down of quota versus a moving up based on all these indices. So I'm happy to put the link in there, or I can share my screen too if that's possible. No, I can't. If that was useful, but I'll at least put a link in for the paper that Jamil's talking about, if that's useful. So the fundamental was how how the harvest control rules would be adjusted by this. And I will say, I know there was more of an adjustment proposed where there was a very small kind of ecosystem adjustment that was actually implemented. And I'll stop
there. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns, ideas? And I'll double check in the chat. Okay, good. All right, so thank you everyone, and huge thank you, Andrew Thompson, to all of your fast finger typing. And so that means that we are up next at 12:30, and let's see, just want to double check. Where's my copy of the agenda go? Too many tabs open. Jamil is going to chair us through the species selection criteria discussion, and I'm going to need to ask somebody who did not take notes this morning and who is not chairing this afternoon to volunteer to take notes this afternoon. So think about your burden level for this afternoon and be ready to raise your hands to take some notes during the session that sessions this afternoon. Okay, phew. Thank you everyone for rolling through a bunch of fast agenda items this morning. Really appreciate it. And it is 11:59. And Kit, would you put up a little banner for people who are wondering that we will be back at 12:30? Thanks everyone.
Start the recording again.
Oh, thank you.
I'll stop sharing. And so, and let me see if I need to promote Jamil as a panelist too, or whatever they're called, to allow him to sign moderator. So that should allow Jamil to share his screen.
Okay, just to double check before we go, or before Jamil gets running, it looks like Kiva and Mary, you volunteered to take notes for this session. Are you on and ready to go? Kiva, Mary, yes? Oh, okay, good. I see your yeses. Excellent. All right. And then I'm just going to quickly ask that everybody else who has not taken notes or is not sharing, you're going to be called on next after this session to take notes during the management schedule session that begins at 1:30. Okay. And then yes, Jamil, we can see your full screen. It looks great. It's very clear. And I will be quiet and let you go ahead and take over. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Yvonne. Okay, I've been asked to talk a bit about selection of stock species and complexes. And before I say anything else, I'm just going to double check that not only you can see my screen, but Yvonne, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Super. Okay. I'll also note that it's a little difficult for me to monitor the chat while I'm in presentation mode, so I'll rely on Yvonne and others to help with that. So as we've been talking about all morning, this workshop today is all about Ecosystem Initiative 4, where we're supposed to review incorporation of climate and ecosystem information into the Council's harvest setting and fisheries management processes, and a few other things. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the process of making that review and determination of timing and pathways as transparent as possible by starting at the very beginning in terms of thinking about which stocks, species, or species complexes we're reviewing climate and ecosystem information for. So really, this is a question of like, well, how do we get started on that selection process? And right now, the way we've gotten started is by talking to one another within the Ecosystem Workgroup and soliciting recommendations from the council, advisory bodies, management teams, and within NIMS staff. And this is the list of stock species and stocks and species that have come up through those conversations. So as you know, Petrale sole was selected by the Ecosystem Workgroup and proposed as the first pilot stock for this initiative, and that has been supported by the council. We're also hearing recommendations from the council to take a look at whether we want to pursue evaluations for sablefish, Pacific sardine, and Chinook salmon, which we've further specified based on conversations amongst NIMS staff to Klamath Fall Chinook, because there are so many salmon stocks that doing all of the Chinook would be a task that might span multiple years rather than the time we have in front of us. We've also had some discussions about a different kind of groundfish or rockfish, Boccaccio in particular, and there's some support for that within NIMS staff. And then assessors in particular of Pacific whiting or hake are interested in seeing this kind of initiative pursued. So that's what we've heard so far through a process of dialogue with the council family and the people most closely involved with the stock assessments. At our March council meeting and in the briefing book, we proposed a draft species selection table that's really, an initial answer to the question of what a framework to make selections of species, stocks or species complexes repeatable and transparent. We're not necessarily answering this question as yes, and that's the hope for today's discussion is kind of to see what a framework like this might look like, how we could make it better, and then if it is actually more useful than the dialogue that's occurred to date. So we received tons of great feedback on the council floor, from advisory bodies and management teams, and from the public, and the tables I'm about to share really reflect input from the EWG and the broader council family, and we're very appreciative. So this initial proposal for a framework for selecting stock species and species complexes falls into 5 general categories of considerations. So I've listed those here on the left. They're management-related considerations, economic considerations, ecological considerations, and then a step back look at the portfolio of stocks that would receive the Ecosystem Initiative 4 treatment, so to speak. I've also listed a 5th consideration of data considerations, which I will talk about more, but I'm going to suggest that those data considerations really come into play more when it comes to synthesizing and presenting the climate and ecosystem information once a stock is selected. And I see that maybe Corey Niles came off mute, and I want to give him a chance to say something if he wants to do so.
No, I don't know how to do that. Sorry, give me accident.
Oh, no problem. Okay, so this is like kind of pretty high level. I'll go one level deeper, and then you're really going to get the technical treatment on what all these things mean. So for management related considerations, what we're thinking about here is there interest in the council family in bringing climate and ecosystem information to bear on a stock or stock complex? Are there concerns about cross fisheries management plan technical interactions like bycatch issues? And does the council have authority over the harvest setting process for the stock of interest? The second category, economic considerations, is around whether this is a stock where there are existing spatial allocation concerns that could be informed well by climate and ecosystem information, whether there are concerns about impacts to the fishery from other ocean uses, such as offshore wind energy development or others. And then a third one, which is around the fishing community dependence on the stock under consideration. And for all of these, as concern around spatial allocation impacts or the dependence of communities on the stock were to increase, that would raise the value of moving forward with an ecosystem initiative for treatment of the stock. Third category are ecological considerations. So here we're proposing that stocks that are thought to be more climate vulnerable should receive the ecosystem initiative for treatment, and we could base this on things like the NIMS climate vulnerability assessment. We also want to consider the ecosystem role. This came, in part from feedback from the CPS-MT, but in particular, are we talking about a stock that's an important prey for other managed predatory species, or the reverse, not limited to trophic interactions, but that's, a simple way to think about it. And then the stock distribution, is this a stock that shows highly variable geographic distribution that's known to be influenced by climate or other factors? Is it one that has a fairly consistent distribution that seems relatively invariant? And then finally, the portfolio considerations, again, that's taking a step back and saying, well, okay, let's just say right now, on Wednesday, we're considering petrale sole and sablefish for a risk evaluation. Well, those are two groundfish. They both come from the same FMP. And so this consideration would ask us to take a step back and say, hey, it could be useful to approach this question of which stocks to evaluate by working across multiple fisheries management plans as the fisheries ecosystem plan is meant to do in general. And then the two other considerations are we representing stocks that span a range of latitudes, so we're not focusing on all Southern California stocks or all Pacific Northwest stocks? And then are we also thinking about stocks that, in a longitudinal sense, those are more nearshore stocks and those that are more offshore? I'm going to move forward for a minute here on sort of what this would look like, because a lot of feedback from the Ecosystem Workgroup was like, okay, great, you've got these considerations, but what kind of scoring rubric could be used? And I just want to present one right now, because I think it will be challenging to give you all of them all at once. But for the management related considerations, here's what a table could look like. We've got the criteria that I just talked about on the previous slide. So whether there's interest in the council family in the ecosystem initiative for treatment for that stock, the technical interactions criterion, and the council authority criterion, along with little definitions. And then if I step forward, I've just drafted some example ways we could evaluate whether or not there's high, medium, or low interest, say, from the council family in moving forward with this stock. And then, stocks that had high ratings across the majority of criteria would be the ones that would be selected for initiative for treatment. To just, there's a lot of text on the slide, and I'm happy to share these later so people can have more time with them, but just to go through a simple one with council authority, the categories here, for example, are the Pacific Council has direct authority via directed harvest and or bycatch limits. That would be a high rating. A medium rating would be that the council collaborates with other entities to have direct authority on harvest and bycatch limits. Or finally, a low category would be there's no direct authority. And again, these are just draft examples of the way something like this could go. So at the risk of causing an epileptic fit, I'm going to quickly move through the other three categories just to show there's text populated that we could review if that feels useful for discussion. And step briefly through the data considerations so that we can open it up for discussion. So I've presented these 4 categories of consideration so far in this proposal. The idea would be that these would help us get to the, well, which stocks or stock complexes are we going to move forward with the Initiative 4 treatment? Once we get to that point, though, we'll need to do some synthesis of climate and ecosystem information to determine whether or not we have a sound scientific basis for classifying ecosystem risk based on the information that is currently available. And so what that looks like at this point are these 4 categories, 2 that have to do with data richness and science readiness. The first one is around broad spatial coverage. So is there climate and ecosystem information that pertains just to a small portion of the stocks domain, or does it pertain to the full domain under council authority? Second is around sort of how much information do we have over a long time horizon. So are there continuous time series that allow us to feel better about our understanding of interannual, interdecadal, and longer timescale variability? Theoretically sound is that if we're going to bring some climate or ecosystem indicator, say like one that populated the stoplights that Corey presented this morning, do we have a sound theoretical basis for thinking that a directional change in that indicator, like freshwater flow rates, will lead to a shift in the abundance and or distribution of a stock or stock complex? And if yes, then that would lead it to a higher rating for using that information to classify risk. And then finally, even if there is a sound theoretical basis for using a climate or ecosystem indicator, does it respond in a way that's very predictable and sensitive to changes in the ecosystem that are reflected in the stock distribution or abundance? And if there's relative insensitivity, that would reduce the value of that indicator for determining risk in the risk evaluation step. So I know I've thrown a lot at you fairly quickly. I'd like to mute myself in a moment here and just kind of hear feedback from folks about what you like and don't like of this overall approach. And in particular, is it better to use a framework like this to document in a transparent way how the council has gone about selecting stocks, species, or species complexes for the Initiative 4 treatment? Or is there a better way to do it? And if there is a better way, what's a good alternative? If we think that this is a reasonable alternative and would like to continue discussing it, I think there's a few questions that comes up of like, who's actually going to do the work of rating the criteria? And Kit has really encouraged us to think through this. Right now, there's more than a dozen different criteria to consider. So are there too many categories of considerations or too many criteria? The question comes up of like, well, what are the most important criteria or considerations? Are they the economic ones? Are they the ones that are management related? Are they ecological, something else? And then finally, and I think this would pertain whether we use this systematic approach or not, are we evaluating stock species or species complexes? And I'll just take a second to define species complexes. What I mean there is we've got over 100 council managed species to think about, and Initiative 4, if it were to move fast based on what we heard from Stephanie and the North Pacific Council experience, we're still looking at what amounts to at least a decade of work to get through all of them with an Initiative 4 treatment that would mirror what's been done in the North Pacific Council. So is there a way to consider complexes as in umbrellas of species that are thought to respond similarly to climate and ecosystem dynamics? Okay, I'm gonna stop there and stop sharing and would welcome discussion.
Hey, this is Kit. I'll jump in front of Yvonne, who's raised her hand. But anyways, usually I'm not always not a committee member. But anyways, I was just sort of thinking about sort of a sequencing problem, maybe you could call it. So as you noted, the EWG recommended the council endorse a species, Petrale sole. There's some other species floating around. And I think the general thought is use that as a test case with maybe, bringing something forward at the September meeting based on that. but then sort of in parallel, you might develop this selection process with, or framework, whatever you want to call it. And well, what happens if you apply that and you don't get that species? And so you sort of come in, well, we worked on petrale, but actually we did a selection evaluation process, and it turns out that Klamath Fall Chinook was a better candidate. So that's kind of a rhetorical question, but just I thought something to think about, just sort of procedurally, how this will work together.
Thanks, Kit. I'm going to check and see if Yvonne put her hand up to respond to that point specifically. If not, I can take a swing.
No, I didn't. Go ahead, Jamil.
Well, Kit, I think we would work on developing that together with input from you and others, but my guess is that we would aspire towards a process that was not either or, but both. So using the table as a framework for laying bare what the council family is thinking would warrant further climate and ecosystem information and why, and then there would need to be advisory body and council discussion around which species to move forward with. How exactly that proceeds and at what pace is, I think that's the point of having this initiative, and I think we get to make it up when that's the fun part.
Can I say something too? I thought that we wrote in one of our statements to the council that the initiative would be complete when we had a pilot study done and we had a process for but there was two prongs to what we had proposed doing, and the other prong was having a system for selecting future species. So I guess I don't really see an issue in moving forward with both at the same time. I see this as very forward looking, whereas instead of just sort of this pilot, there's a pilot study that's happening for a species that we all agreed on, and then this is sort of a more forward looking systemic, how are we going to apply this long term?
Yeah, thanks for that reminder about what we set out to do and committed to doing as part of this initiative. And so in some ways that answers question one here on the screen, which is developing a process and approach that can be repeated. There's probably other ways that we could do that beyond having a table with tons of criteria, but this at least really provides a step-by-step process. Jessica, I saw your hand up next, I believe. But you're still muted, so I can't quite hear you. Oh no, I can see you're talking, but I can't hear you. She's working on that. Anyone else? While we're waiting, oh, I see Elliot's hand. Go ahead, Elliot.
Just a quick question, and if you mentioned this and I missed it, I apologize, Jamil, but did you envision that these tables, again, recognizing they may not be filled out completely as part of the initiative, did you envision that they would be primarily filled out by the EWG, or would they be done in collaboration with the various management teams that are, yeah, okay, got it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, though, because it draws out too, and I'd love to hear people's opinions. I'll answer with an initial thought of my own, and Elliot, if you have a response, that's great. So in my ideal, so if we were to use all the considerations and all the criteria that I presented, or even a subset, I suspect that a reasonable approach would be for the EWG to commit to the initial scoring, but only to get to a conversation with the advisory bodies and management teams that are most close to each of the species that are being evaluated, so that they could sort of react and put a check on some of those evaluations, and that product that was based on the collaboration of the EWG with the relevant advisor and engaged advisory bodies and management teams would be what would go to the SSC or the council for their further evaluation. I'm open to other ideas.
Yeah, so my quick suggestion was just to make sure we engage early with the various management teams to make sure they have the bandwidth and interest in the species being included as well. Because I think there's one of these questions is, is this a good species in theory to do versus is this a good species in practice to do? Because it would have strong legs. And so that trade-off is something I'm very worried about, or not worried, but want to pay attention.
Jamil, can I do an audio test? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Welcome back.
Thanks. I was just going to say, and it may have now already been said, but I really like the transparency part of this process and a systematic approach, and that kind of really lends into what Kiva was discussing of us providing pilots that we're going to step through this process with, at the same time having criteria that then can be commented on and changed over time to inform how we would move forward with prioritization and evaluation of different species and complexes.
Thanks for that, Jessica, and we're glad we can hear you again now. One thing I will add to the conversation about having this process is that something I was thinking about and talked with a few of you about as I was drafting this was trying to be realistic around capacity and sort of what we could do in a workable amount of time. And so I think what that could lead to is some of these considerations and criteria and the way they're evaluated feeling a little bit hurried or unsatisfying, but the flip side of that is that we can actually do it on a timeline that works so that we don't get stuck at the what species are we going to choose step, and can spend more time thinking carefully about how to synthesize the climate and ecosystem information and translate it into a risk classification. Yvonne, feel free to respond to that, or you had your hand up first and I'm happy to dovetail to it, something else.
No, I just, this conversation is going in the direction that I was hoping it was going. So thank you, everyone. Yeah, I really liked, Jamil, what you had to say about, the EWG doing a first cut, and, because a lot of the way we've operated in the past is the EWG does a bunch of detail work, synthesizes it, sends it out to the other advisory bodies, who then react and, in their reaction add, context and meaning and ideas to the process, and help us, make sure that it gets through the council process. So, I mentioned this to Jamil by email, but one thing that struck me about, we went through this criteria process and getting responses from the advisory bodies. And we now have a pretty long list of criteria. And I just wonder, are any of them, as we're sort of trying to narrow this for the council, let's think about ways that we can sort species quickly and then get that information to the advisory bodies for their reactions and enhancement. And so, are there any of these criteria that are redundant to each other? Do we really need all of these criteria? We just want a way of kind of sorting through species and species groups. So, and then I see, I'm going to lower my hand. I think somebody else raised a hand or made a
I think I need to
comment in
catch up
chat.
to the chat, if that's all right, Yvonne. Yeah, so there's a number of good comments in the chat. I'm going to start at the top. So Andy, I'm going to read this first because it'll help me make sure I understand it. So Andy Lysing has asked, would you consider going the opposite direction and first figure out who and what resources you have to do this work, and then work backwards from there to determine the answers to some of these questions? So I think this latest exchange addresses that in part, which is the proposal that the EWG would be on the hook to do the initial drafting of the species selection work. But the criteria that's here, which is about advisory body interest, would hopefully help us determine whether or not the relevant advisory bodies have the bandwidth and resources to meet with us to determine whether our evaluations make sense to them or not. And if they don't, this could, be the kind of criteria that would, if we did a geometric mean score or something, this one would be a 0, like there's no interest for a particular stock, and so we can't move forward with it. That's one way we could approach that. Then when we get to the data considerations step, where we need to synthesize climate and ecosystem information, I think that's where your question, Andy, about what resources and who would do the work will really come into play, and also like how much information is already synthesized. So I take your point. I don't have a solution to it, but my concern would be if we always worked backwards, then you'd have this kind of vortex of attraction, so that, I'm not going to call out a stock, but everybody's favorite and most valuable stock would always get the Initiative 4 treatment, and the others, which might be of more concern and potentially high value or high importance, in 10 years wouldn't get that treatment. So anyways, I'm sort of talking through the way I think about it. Let me just pause there and see if that provokes any ideas from you, Andy.
No, that was, you got it. I mean, it was kind of more like a little bit like, I think what Kit you were explaining, Kit kind of said to you, is identifying who would do what. I just wouldn't, I don't think it would be the case, but I just would caution that, something that looks good on paper, a stock to do, you go through the whole selection process and say, this is the one we want to do. And then at the end of the day, whoever it is that's the most knowledgeable about that stock maybe just isn't able to be involved or something, right? It'd be like, okay, then what do you do, right? Do you go try to hire someone else or find someone else to fill in, or you know what I mean? So it's more like, I don't necessarily want you to go completely backwards, because I agree with what you said, that everybody's favorite fish becomes the one to do. But just as you develop, as you're working through the scenario, be sure you have, I guess, identified who would actually be, if the expertise on that species or stock is available to do that work.
Yeah, that's a great practical consideration, and maybe at the risk of adding more to the list of criteria, could even be incorporated there. I'm going to move to Pearson's question. There's a exchange in the chat, and so maybe I'll pause and see, Katie, if you want to come off mute and ask it, or sort of respond to the responses to your question.
Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. I just was asking about kind of the nexus between this exercise and the groundfish stock assessment prioritization list, because it does seem to me it would depend on where those on-ramps are that you want this process Initiative 4 to kind of inform. And if it is the management for that cycle, I think that stock assessment prioritization list would be wildly important. And there's that list, and then there's also like a list. I'm going to get my times wrong, I think, but happens, I think, June before the assessment year. We state which species, which stocks will be assessed, but then the GMT also indicates kind of in the future cycle. So not the cycle that's about to happen, but in 2025 for this. So there's kind of an indication of what will happen in the future based upon the GMT kind of looking at that prioritization list. So I don't know, that could be a useful resource, I would think.
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. I'm going to ask Kiva to maybe weigh in on how that stock assessment prioritization for groundfish works now. I'll say that I would love the prioritization to be one of the on-ramps that we are thinking about, but I would feel like we fell short of the promise of the initiative if it were the only one that we fed into. And Kiva, where I'm going with passing the mic to you is just knowing that Kristen Marshall had at some point worked on developing some ecosystem considerations that contributed to stock assessment prioritization for groundfish, and I'm not knowledgeable about the current use and application of those considerations.
Yep. First of all, I think within the groundfish FMP, I think that stock assessment prioritization is one of the most tractable ways to like incorporate climate and ecosystem information to me. And it's like an inherently multi-species process, which is also really appealing. So I totally agree with Katie. I think what Kristen did was take like outputs from ecosystem models. So it's very so it's basically like it's an ecosystem importance. I believe she's unfortunately in Norway, but I think it's static. So like hake, right, are a very central species in the food web. That was a bad example because we're required to assess that every year. But so they would have a high ecosystem importance, for example. And so that's how it currently exists in the stock assessment prioritization. I think it would be really cool to be able to get something that's a bit more dynamic in time and sort of gets it sort of like the risk the stock might be experiencing. And the flip side, the challenge with that is it's sort of an all or nothing, or you would need to think of a slick way to account for species where you're not doing that. So, right, it's going to be really easy for us to get like a year by year risk for sablefish, but a year by year risk for chili pepper rockfish might be harder to come by. And so we need to be able to rank every species in the groundfish FMP to do the prioritization. Those are some of my thoughts at the moment.
Thanks, Kiva. That was really helpful. And Will, thank you for the link, which I had to revert to not looking at because then everybody would have to look at it with me unless I stopped sharing my screen. But I believe that'll show the current prioritization that's used. Other thoughts about the approach to species selection? I see a hand from Corey Niles. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jamil. Maybe repeating somewhat what Akiva was saying, but we did talk about this and when we were in person, and Kristen was there for part of that. I guess I see. I don't know if Will is joking about John Field and Shelley Pepper, but he made me remember that the council would have expressed interest in not a full normal assessment, but a look at short belly rockfish and like what may have happened when the population boomed. And so there I guess there's two. I heard Kivit saying two things, and I think what Kristen's input does now is look at the trophic importance of the other part of and that would pull out something like short belly. But yeah, but then that's, I think, what Kristen was saying, and Kiva, you said this too, but articulating for my own sake, I guess, it's also the other parts of the ecosystem and affecting, trends in the stock itself, risk in the stock. So yeah, I don't think that part is in the stock assessment prioritization. The trophic part, I think, was, but yeah, I forgot about short belly if I haven't mentioned it in our recent meetings. That's an example of council doesn't have interest in setting an ACL for it, but it changed a lot in how it was interacting with the fishery, and on top of that, it's thought to have trophic importance. So, point there, it might come out. That might come out. We want to know more about it, even though it's not part of the normal stock assessment process.
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, I'm reminded of the point Andy made earlier this morning about would it be useful to kind of go back and work through these criteria during a different period of time, like the blob with short belly, and be like, wait, would we have thought that short belly should have been assessed? And if not, we just broke the system. And did we do we want to unbreak it, or is that just the system we've set up and that's something that those are going to be surprises? But I definitely take your point. I'll briefly say that I would hope that these days short belly would come up under the management related considerations on all counts. I don't know what their CVA score is. I do think that the stock distribution situation would rate it higher. So anyways, I think there are opportunities for short belly to kind of rise in the rankings with this kind of system, but it would be interesting to actually work it through and see what came out. I saw Don's hand next, and then Andrew's.
One clarification there, Jamila, maybe I didn't say it. Like short belly wouldn't even show up in our stock assessment priority, I think, because it's an ecosystem component species that doesn't have a OFL, ABC, or ACO. So that was a distinction, but.
Okay, thank you. I got you. Go ahead, Don.
Okay. SCS interest, we meet in person only twice a year. So that is only time allocated for season setting related to Chinook and coho for commercial and recreational fisheries. The tribal fishery is set in parallel to that process. Various states are involved with that, but the SAS is not involved with that tribal fishery setting process. The in-season forecast is used by many states for setting seasons beyond the Chinook and coho. So it's very broad and loose. So I would suggest we have a well-developed process before we start tackling salmon.
Okay, thanks for that thought there, Don. Noted for sure. Andrew, your turn.
Thanks, Jamil. This is a great discussion. I think that, I do want to emphasize something that's already been said, and that is the practicality of our capacity to, choose species for which we think we're in a good position to get a good answer at this time. Something that's, so species for which we have good information about the actual drivers of their population dynamics. And since this is an exercise, this is kind of a proof of concept exercise at this point. So I would emphasize that maybe perhaps over stock assessment considerations in the near future.
Andrew, I might not be alone, and I caught some of that, but not all of it. So I'm going to tell you what I heard, which is we want to make sure we have a sound basis for linking climate and ecosystem dynamics to the stock of interest. But I didn't catch the other piece, microphone issue or something. Could you correct what I said if I got it wrong and add to it either way?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
That's a lot better. I don't know what changed, but
that's
it's better.
Yeah, I guess my thought is that this is, at this point, this is almost a proof of concept exercise. Can we find species and provide ecosystem information that helps identify their drivers? And so I think I would raise that as the main priority at this stage, as opposed to the practical consideration of whether this is going to inform management policies for a given species in the near term. Ideally, we have species where both criteria are met, but I think at this point, if we have to make a choice, and specifically I'm talking about something like anchovy versus sardine, sardine are probably definitely the species that are more economically valuable, but I think that anchovy are the ones where we'll have a better chance to actually solve the problem of what's driving their populations at present. So, I think that's a really important consideration at this point. Do we have species? Are we going to be focusing on species where we can make sensible conclusions as to the sort of oceanographic drivers that are really making their populations go up and down?
Okay, thanks for repeating that. And that was filled with provocations, I would say. So 2 things that I heard from Andrew. One is let the science lead, and don't worry about whether there's a management or economic interest in the stock that we select. And second, anchovies and not sardine. If that didn't stir the pot, I don't know what will. Does anybody want to chime in on either of those points? And I'll just note that there's a few legacy hands that are going to confuse me in just a few minutes because I have a short-term memory problem. So Don and Corey and Andrew, if you don't mind putting your hands down, unless you'd like me to call on you again, that would be helpful.
Sorry.
Okay.
I can take the bait, Jamil. I guess.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'll take the bait. I guess just I get that this is a proof of concept, but isn't it a proof of concept in implementing these like ecosystem considerations and management? And like I guess what it seems like there's been, you know, there's tons of scientific studies on ecosystem indicators. I feel like we don't need another proof of concept on that. They exist. And so to me, the very point is that it needs to be implemented in management. I don't know.
Thanks for sharing that perspective. Tim, I saw a comment from you in the chat agreeing with Andrew, but now you've heard Kiva, so are you swayed one way or the other?
I think we need to pick a winner and show that it works. I mean, the point of entry and the possible uses of it, I think that's important. I one of the notes I made off of Stephanie's presentation this morning was that it started with, how is this thing going to be applied? And I don't know that we have figured that out yet. I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the on-ramps, is like, how is this going to enter into the management process? And that should then determine what information you bring and how you apply it. So I think we're still feeling our way in the darkness here, and I'm not exactly sure until we figured out the direction that we're going that we need to put a whole lot of effort into it in terms of the scientific aspects of it. That if I didn't put my foot in my mouth there, I'm never going to do it. So I'm going to stop right now.
Thanks, Tim. This is a super important point of discussion, in my opinion. I'm just going to chime in before I call on Don to see if his hand was up from before, if he had a contribution, and then Jessica. But what I'll say is I'm very conscious of this not being a loading dock model of doing science, which is we're going to do the science and hope it gets used at some point down the line, and wanting to make sure that we're doing the co-development component of science that can be used. And if we just rely on where we have good understanding, we may not add information that is actually useful beyond the stock assessments themselves. That's just my opinion. I'm not representing the whole EWG or NIMS or whatever. Don, let me check and I see an X. Okay, you're good. Jessica, and then Corey Niles.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree that this pilot should be a proof of concept where we identify on-ramps, we identify the different mechanisms, and then we use species that have probably the best case scenario to develop those proofs of concept. But I agree that simultaneously we have to be developing a transparent process for the future that will be for other prioritized species that maybe don't meet that high of criteria, like maybe they're data poor, but they're also really economically important. And therefore we want to be able to have ways in which those species can go through this process too and still have ecosystem included or at least considered during some of these harvest setting specifications. So I like both methods happening at the same time, where maybe for our proof of concept, we're cherry picking, but we're creating a process that wouldn't cherry pick.
I appreciate that perspective. Make everybody happy. Good job. Corey, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be kind of repetitive. I think, you know, sometimes, and we had this discussion internally numerous times in the past year, and then it's almost sometimes we're just trying to find the perfect stock to do, when it really is, the questions could be, you know, is it going to be doable, and is it going to be helpful and used? And we're going to have it for a while, maybe a lot more choices than we have capacity for. So it's like, let's not pretend like we're trying to find the perfect stock to do. Let's find one that's going to be doable. So yeah, sometimes we get in that trap, it seems, but we're going to have a lot more work for the foreseeable future than people to do it.
Got it. Thanks, Corey. Let's see who else is in the queue. Josh, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jamil. And thanks for leading us through this discussion. So I agree with the points Corey and Jessica are making, but maybe I'm going to back Andrew a little bit, that I do think this data consideration component that you put together, I think it's going to be really important, because in the end, if we want all those things to happen in terms of integration and management and use and things, we're always going to be tripped up by this data component if we don't feel good about it. So I think making sure we feel good about those data considerations, and I think that can also help inform some of the discussion on the other parts of the rubric. So just putting a plug in that, although the science is always evolving and we're going to learn new things, that starting out that be a high driver for some of the choices we make.
Got it. Thanks. Corey, I still see your hand up, but I'm going to guess that is like...
You're getting good,
nope.
getting good at this.
Other thoughts from the group? So I'm hearing that there is a bit of dialogue here and maybe a need to get closer to resolution about whether or not we're going to approach the question of how to select stocks in a way that's hierarchical or not, where some considerations like data have a higher priority and primary sort of filter, followed by other considerations, or just the reverse. And so I'm not sure about how to resolve that discussion point, but I do think it's important that we capture that there are various perspectives on the best way forward for that. I would say that the other way to think about it, rather than being hierarchical, is the relative weights that go into the different types of considerations. So weighting data considerations higher than the other four categories would be another approach for coming up with an overall high, medium, low priority for the initiative for treatment. I also just wanted to make sure we captured the idea from that initial exchange with Kit, which I think is that kind of co-development and co-rating of species for selection is kind of the goal, and how we document that process is what we're trying to do as part of this initiative. Using a table like this is one element of it, and then the council process itself is another, and how the table gets evaluated. The proposal here is that it would be a collaborative effort between the EWG and other advisory bodies. I think we have another 10 minutes if we need it. Open to other ideas, thoughts from the group.
So, Jamil, it's totally fine to end earlier than 1:30, and I see Jessica's hand is up next, and just wanted to make sure that people who are on the call and are not on the EWG, if you want to chime in with questions or suggestions on the species selection criteria, please don't tell us what your favorite species are, because we're not at that point in the process, but sort of, we can end earlier than 1:30, but just make sure that everybody has a chance to weigh in if they want to. And I'll just be quiet and let Jessica go ahead.
Thanks, Yvonne. I was just, after that last point you just made, Jamil, I guess I'm just thinking about clarification. So is the thought process that there would be this table of criteria, the EWG would work with the different advisory bodies to come up with prioritizations for the different FMPs. And then that would be presented to council, similar to, let's say, the groundfish stock assessment prioritization, where you have all these different bodies providing their feedback on what they think the priority species should be, but then council makes that final decision based on the information that's provided to them. Is that what I'm hearing is a potential process, or did I mishear that?
I think you heard it and connected some dots and put it together in a helpful way. The only part I didn't hear was maybe at the very beginning, if I think about how this process worked, which was that kind of bubbling up that happens when the launch of a new initiative occurs. So we maybe that would go like, hey, initiative 4 is scoping new stocks for evaluation. Then there's some time for initial conversations, comments from the advisory bodies, council discussion. That then feeds into the table and the criteria sort of thing, which the EWG populates. Then we get comments from the advisory bodies, and then everything you said. So just that initial kind of bubble up seems like a useful step. Otherwise, the alternative, I guess, in my mind is we've got the full list of FMPs and stocks, and we start with that and try to do them all, but I'm overwhelmed by that prospect. And Yvonne is too, apparently, or she thinks I'm funny. I saw a hand. It's Kit. Go ahead, Kit.
Yeah, I just wanted, so the bubbling up, that it seems to me that's happened for the initial go round, right? And you had a slide there that listed the stocks and various players who were endorsing those stocks. So am I right in that sense that the bubbling up has happened for this go round, but that could be integrated sort of semi-formally into future go rounds, where that could be an input to a more formal prioritization process?
Yes. Just seeing your comment in the chat, Michelle. This is a great job identifying criteria and considerations. I think it's important for this pilot to include and document considerations so that the process is replicable and the initial stocks and indicators are sufficient to provide demonstration of risk analysis. Did you want to add anything there, Michelle, or are you happy with what you wrote in the chat? Appreciate that point. Okay, why don't I make a last call for comments and ideas around the selection of species, and in particular, well, no, I won't even do it in particular. I'll just say, are there any final comments or questions? Corey, your hand's up, and I'm going to believe it this time.
It is. Thanks, man. I guess that I'm kind of thinking and kind of maybe at the groundfish model, because it is the one where we do have a regular assessment cycle, and thinking of the North Pacific, like if we could, why not have a risk table for every stock that's being assessed is the thought bouncing around my head. So I mean, and the answer to that would be, maybe the data is not there, not enough of you all to go around. So just making the obvious part of the discussion will be the capacity and like how many, kind of like the stock assessment themselves, how many assessors do we have? How many star panels are there? So yeah, like this time around, I mean, we were debating, let's pick one because that's all we thought we had the capacity to do. And then, well, maybe we can do 2 or 3. So it's just that how many piece in the capacity for you all who are doing that type of work to bring that to part of the discussion will be important too, is the point I'm going at in a long-winded way. Because I think we would say, yes, if you can give us one for everyone, why wouldn't we, like the North Pacific?
Yeah, that brings me back to the practical considerations that we were talking about, in particular with Andy Lysing's comment. And I don't know if it becomes a formal part of the table, but it certainly seems like an important part of the scoping process. Maybe it could be part of this bubble up or call for proposed species would be kind of a scoping about bandwidth from the parties that would be affected or influenced if we were to move forward with some of the species. That seems like a good initial step. Andrew, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, thanks, Jamil. Like, just to build on Corey's comment, I think that one of the things that'll be interesting that we get out of this process is evaluating which, variables to include for a given species. And so, for example, is the PDO a useful measure of, predicting the population dynamics of a given species, or is it not? Is it useful for one species but not the other? So I think that in this process, we'll be able to win down the types of environmental indicators that are put into each species, and it'll help us think about, for example, the life stage at which you're more likely to have a recruitment bottleneck for a given species. And that might vary depending on which species you're talking about. But this type of process will be super helpful for really helping us understand what it is we need to prioritize for a given species. And then moving on to Corey's comment about, do we have something like this for every species? Ultimately, yes, I think that would be the goal. But this is a step in helping us understand what we need to put into a species-specific, indicator of performance, and then whether it makes sense for other species and whether there's commonalities between species that, can help. But at any rate, this is, going back to my initial comment, that this is a proof of concept about how to do this. And then hopefully it'll serve as a template for filling out this type of information for all the species moving forward. Lower my hand.
Yes, I'm conscious of our agenda, but that has been that's more good food for thought for me, Andrew, and I'd like to chat with you more about that. In particular, I'll just say I'm thinking about, is there a way to do what you just were doing as a thought experiment, but come to a conclusion in a fairly efficient way? Like, yeah, the PDO is good, boom, and we know, or it's totally not working anymore for this stock. But also it has me thinking about whether or not Initiative 4 treatment could catalyze needed work about the role of climate and ecosystem dynamics for stocks that have high assessment uncertainty for any number of reasons. And so there's like a time scale of how much, and a capacity component to evaluating whether we could do that. But I think it's a really good suggestion to make sure we're giving a hard look at the data and information we have available. I think it's time for me to pass the mic back to Yvonne for the final portion, maybe the final penultimate portion of our agenda.
Yes.
Thanks everybody for the good dialogue.
Thank you so much, Jamil. That went really well. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for weighing in. So we are next going to move on to management schedules for groundfish, salmon, and CPS. And Jessica Watson of Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is going to chair that for us. And I want to make sure, so if you have not chaired and if you have not been note-taking, you know who you are. Please volunteer yourselves to do some note-taking for this session so that we can give other people some, rest for their fingers. And and we'll leave Jessica to manage hands and conversation. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks
Go
for that,
ahead.
Yvonne. So I don't have a presentation. Mainly, I just wanted to go over pretty much what we had in our March report. So, and kind of the feedback we got based on our requests to the different advisory bodies on when in their FMP harvest setting process is it most useful to bring in ecosystem and climate information. And part of this is really kind of dovetailing on what Jamil just touched on, is this capacity is also part of this, and also thinking about, like we talked about previously, the different on-ramps might change when these timescales might be most appropriate based on people's and teams' capacities to bring in that information and also receive that information and provide input on that information. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, but I think the main takeaway that I have found from our table from our March report is that based on the FMP, there's different points in which this information can come in. And those different points may be based on the management process, but I would like to have a little bit more discussion on what about outside of the management process, like when would the management teams have the capacity to deal with that information? When would the advisory bodies have, or the ASs have time to review that and provide their feedback? You know, is it smack dab in the middle of a fishing season, and so they wouldn't have time for that? But we heard about from John about like how many times the SAS meets. So when is a really good time for salmon to bring that information to get industry feedback, as well as then the scientists that are providing this information, when's a good time in their time scale to provide that feedback, and trying to find that nexus where all of that information can come together, I think is going to be somewhat challenging, and have it still be part of this management process. So I kind of wanted to start with that discussion, and looks like I can present. So I'll put up the table that we had. Let's see. So if everyone can see, this is the table that we were talking about from our March report for groundfish. There's, you know, September through June is kind of a time, but it's September and November of odd years and March through June of even years. So there's also this every other year phase 2 based on different management cycles. And so we kind of have all of this going on where, depending on where we're focusing, that information can come in at different points. So I guess I wanted to start off with what people's thought process is on when, like to Kit's questions, the when, the who, and the hows. So if us as a GMT, or us as the EWG, are providing information to the GMT, when's the most appropriate time to provide them? If our pilot species is petrale, right now they're in the middle of a stock assessment. So is that the best time because the information's being updated, or should we be doing this in between those cycles? So I thought I would just initiate that process first, or see if there's anyone who has comments, thoughts, or questions there. And go ahead, Yvonne.
Well, so thank you, Jessica. That was a great launching of the conversation. And I wanted to just, I know we've sort of been paying attention to this, but I wanted to remind folks that it certainly in the groundfish process, we're thinking about 2 different and maybe more entry points. One is during the stock assessment prioritization process, and then another is during the harvest setting process. And there may be different pieces of information that go into each of those, and it may even be the case that one eventually influences the other. But so think about, you know, both of those processes. And I don't know if Katie is still on, but I particularly wanted to maybe nudge. Oh, it looks like we've got Katie Pearson from the GMT and the ODF&W, and Kate Richardson from NIMS and the GMT.
And Whitney's there too, as well. It looks
Dan
like.
Waldeck from the GAP. And I'm just looking, I know some of you are groundfish experts. We've got Gretchen Hanshoe from NIMS, who's got a lot of groundfish management experience. And then Whitney Roberts from the GMT and the WDFW. So if you don't want to be noticed, please hang up.
Well, I would add, Yvonne, I think that's a really good point. And I think based on what we saw earlier, those schematics are really helpful to see when information can come in and out. But we kind of need a schematic per on-ramp, right? So what tool or mechanism we're using to put ecosystem information, and then seeing what does that timeline look like. And I think those directed asks are going to be will give us more insight to our first ask, was just like, hey, everyone, when do you think you would want ecosystem information? And as we start learning what these different on-ramps are, I think it'll be more pointed questions. It's like, hey, GMT GAP, if we're using stock assessment prioritization, what does that time scale look like? If we're using, a risk table, what does that timeline look like? And I guess that's where I'm a little curious to get input, but also hear, like, would that be useful for September, coming up with these much more specific requests based on tool on-ramps? So open to hear anyone who wants to chat about any of those topics. I see a hand. Lynn, go for it.
Mic check, I've been having issues today.
I can hear you great, Lynn. Thanks.
Okay. I am no longer on the GMT, but I'm the most recently retired GMT team historian. I appreciate this question, Yvonne. I was going to ask it in the chat about the different on-ramps. And I see there actually being 3 really good nexuses into groundfish management. One of the first ones would be when we're prioritizing stocks for assessment. That big, obnoxious, huge, multicolored, color-coded worksheet that Jim Hasty has. Is there a way to incorporate some of this stuff into that worksheet to help with which stocks we prioritize for assessment? Then the next one would be the assessments themselves. How does it incorporate it into the assessment themselves? That would have to start in, shortly after we make the decision on which assessments we've prioritized, which was last fall. And then as far as how to incorporate into the management measures piece of it, it would have to be September of the odd year. It would have to start being incorporated in November. If you get to March, April of the even year, you're too late. The GMT has done all the analysis over winter, etc. And we start having deadlines come up. So there's several things that would have to happen, I think, in the even year getting ready for assessments, and then by September of the odd year to be incorporated into management, just based on how the groundfish process has been working for the last 7-8 cycles.
Thanks for that, Lynn. Any other comments or discussion around groundfish from any of the other groundfish?
Lynn, can I make sure I just wrote down what you said correctly? So assessment prioritization, that on-ramp happens like in June of even numbered years. And then
yeah, somewhere in that time frame.
Around then. Okay. And then directly into the assessment itself is sort of like fall, winter, spring of even to odd, while the assessment scientists are working on the assessment.
Correct.
And then September, and then for the sort of risk table harvest specification kind of approach, that would be in like September, November of odd years.
Yeah, the council adopts ACLs preliminarily in November of odd years. And the management measures for those ACLs start being developed in September and November.
Great. Thank you.
Of odd years.
Thanks for that. Corey, I see your hands up. And it looks like we have confirmation from Katie and Gretchen that they agree with what Lynn said. Go ahead, Corey. Sorry about that.
Just add a couple things that Lynn said that might be helpful for other. Well, the stock assessment priority it's a 2-step thing, and it turned into a 3 or 4-step thing this past time. But so it's like March and then June. But then the other thing is like a longer time horizon. The main focus is on the next stock assessment cycle, but we're also talking about the cycle after that. So if longer timelines for thinking how to get ready for the ecosystem side of things, it could also be like next time it's going to be 2025, and then also talking about 2027, for example. So just adding that, there's looking at 2 cycles at once kind of thing.
So Corey, to think about that then, prior to all that process, there would have to be some gathering of information to kind of inform the start of that, right? So like before that June time period, there would be bringing together of information from like the science side of updates that would then potentially influence that.
Well, I think what Gretchen clarified in that it starts March. The first time is March. Then everyone gives feedback, and then the council makes its final recommendation. So it'd have to you'd think it would have to be ready for that first March cut.
Great, thanks for that. And I see, Katie, your hand's up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess this is why I brought up that prioritization spreadsheet when we were talking with Jamil, because I see that as almost, you could use it, kind of what Corey just outlined, like we start talking about the next cycle, you could use that as your base of like the species that you as the EWG would then go forth and like do that kind of your prioritization or whatever you were calling it, your because at least you'd start with not the whole list. You would start with maybe 8, I don't really remember, but kind of depending on the year. And those are the stocks that are slated for the next cycle.
Great, thanks for that, Katie. Corey, is this a legacy hand I see? Or do you have something else to add?
Yeah, sorry.
All right, seems like we have a lot of clarification then, and also agreement then on kind of that prioritization process and how it would start for ground fish. Do we want to discuss anything else from a ground fish level of how this kind of process would work and the time frames in which information can be put into the process for management? Oh, Jamil, I see your hand now. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks. I was just looking at the very helpful presentation that Will or somebody put in the chat that Chantel and Jim presented around stock assessment prioritization, and noticing that there's 4 categories, 4 factors that contribute: fishery importance, stock status, ecosystem importance, and assessment information. And so seeing that, it makes me think that what we're doing in Initiative 4 would be, at most a 25% contribution to the overall decision making around which stocks to prioritize for assessment. And it does look like there's more that could be done in terms of evaluating ecosystem importance, even though Kristen Marshall and others have made good inroads into that. So I don't want to diminish the potential value there, but I also want to go back to kind of how the initiative was specified. And it says that we should develop clear pathways for it being used in the setting of scientific uncertainty, harvest policy, and specific management actions. And so I guess in reading that, it seems to me like stock assessment prioritization doesn't contribute to the setting of scientific uncertainty, harvest policy, or specific management actions. And so that's where I come into we don't want to stop there as this is our only on-ramp for groundfish or for other species. And I'd just be kind of curious to hear other people's perspectives about that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jamil. Does anyone else want to jump in? I can jump to that timeline in this document where it's kind of the entire process is laid out of the harvest setting process for groundfish. But there are, the multiple places, right? So we've talked a little bit earlier about P-Star came up a bit. So there's that process. I see a hand, but I cannot find the person. Go ahead, Will.
Yeah, thanks. This is sort of in response to what Jamil said. First, I mean, I would agree that in terms of the stock prioritization, ecosystem considerations are only one of the 4 things that go into it. But then if you actually look at the sort of scoring formula, like the percent contribution to the overall prioritization score is, it's not 25% for each of those categories. So sort of, while I agree that there's a lot more that could be done in terms of the ecosystem considerations part of the scoring, I don't think it will have a huge effect on the prioritization. And if the focus is sort of on determining P-star or scientific uncertainty and risk tolerance, I would also, that at least the way we do things now, that really the prioritization is not when that is being decided. Although I personally would argue that if you actually want to preserve the sort of what I understand is the original intent of the P-star sigma system is to sort of separate out sigma scientific uncertainty, P-star is risk tolerance. I personally would actually say stock assessment prioritization is the perfect time to be setting P-star, because that's when you've been considering all the factors that should set your risk tolerance. But as a practical matter, that doesn't seem to be how people want to set P-star. They want to sort of know what the risk tolerance is. So it's long-winded way of saying, yeah, I agree with Jamil.
Thanks for that, Will. And it looks like, Dan, did you want to speak to what you've written here in the chat?
Okay, I've got my Bluetooth headphones on. It looks like you can hear me a little bit. Is that good? I can switch headphones if you want.
Yeah, we can hear you. At least I can, Dan.
Yeah, the point I'm trying to make here, and I think it's captured and Lynn agrees with me, is that it shouldn't just be new stocks that the council is prioritizing and then assessing where we use ecosystem information. Yes, there are logical inroads, pathways to accomplish that, and maybe that is a first objective, first goal to pursue. But what I'm thinking about is more holistically, though. It shouldn't just be new stocks that are being assessed where this information is important and useful to managers.
Thanks for that. I see a hand just popped up. Go ahead, Josh.
Thanks, Jessica. I guess in response also to Jamil's comment, if I was understanding the point he was making, I see the choice in this groundfish context. The reason they go through a process to prioritize stocks is to do a new stock assessment to then change the current harvest levels, really. And I'll let the 8 different groundfish people tell me I'm wrong. So in that context, I do see prioritizing which stock assessment gets done sooner than later, definitely involved in our management process, harvest specifying process. So obviously it's a different link than P-star, but I still see it connected.
Thanks for that, Josh. Jamil, do you have a response? Or?
I like the all of the above perspective that Dan provided. So I agree with that in general. But I guess the only thing I would add is that I'd be cautious about the opportunity to get stuck in the process if we focus entirely on the prioritization, because I contributed to that a while ago, and it feeds itself a bit too. And so just keeping our eye on the multiple on-ramps, as we have talked about doing as an EWG all along, seems really useful. But I really agree with the all of the above being strategic point.
Yeah, so it seems like it might be good to have some of this outlined for potentially that kind of September report. Some components of that could be really breaking up for each one of these FMPs, what those on-ramps are, what those time scales look like, and how we see that information being incorporated. Yvonne, I saw your hand go up.
Thanks. So I was wondering, given that there already is this stock assessment prioritization process and there already is this giant multi-colored factor overview table, I wonder, for stock assessment prioritization, and I agree we have to talk about other parts of the process, but for that part of the process, would it be more efficient for us to suggest an additional factor or factors to that ecosystem factors to that process than to suggest that we provide a set of risk tables or other whatever to that process? Am I making any sense there? Just like, instead of creating a new process to tack onto that, is there a way for us to integrate into the existing process?
That's a good question, Yvonne. I was thinking the same thing. It seems like since ecosystem is, like Jamil said, a part of that stock prioritization, it could be adding components that we think would strengthen its consideration in that process. But to me, like the risk tables or, any of these other tools happen at a different phase once the stock assessment process is happening. So to me, it's like, it's two separate, right? We would want to probably have, and this work capacity and, availability of people and resources is going to be really important, that maybe we just have an overview of what should be considered in that prioritization process pathway, but then more effort is actually placed when developing a risk table, right? Because that's going to require more effort. But interested to hear what other people's thoughts are on that as well. That's just my initial thought. And there's also a conversation around lovely Peace Star happening in the chat. So if anyone wants to weigh in on that as well, feel free. But it seems like what we're talking about here are these different pathways, but also how much energy and effort and the products that would go into those pathways, right? So is it just an advisory, or is there more information that needs to be brought in? And where should that be prioritized? Talking about species priorities, there's also pathway priority for consideration of where this information would be coming in. Or is it at all of the different on-ramps? All right.
Jessica, I'll just quickly respond to what you said. Triggered a thought for me, which is it seems like it, and Yvonne's question here, it seems like it would be silly for us not to try to contribute to the ecosystem importance factor in the stock assessment prioritization process as part of this initiative if we have information that could be brought to bear on it. And that seems like an easy win. And then we can also be focusing on other potential on-ramps. So I think that's what you were saying, but I just wanted to say I agree with that, that perspective.
Yeah, Elliot, I see your hands up. Go for it.
I'm going to be difficult and hopefully not make more work for myself and others, but I don't want to simply do the stock prioritization, get the ecosystem information in there and then call it a win and be done though. I think these other on-ramps, and I know this is echoing a lot of what Jamil said earlier, and as well as Dan's very astute comment in the chat and verbally, is we need to be looking for multiple pathways and, be a little bit future-proof there. So.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Elliot. Thanks for that. Seems like there's also consensus from Yvonne in the chat there too. Do we want, there's another, oh, that's Elliot, I think that's your hand, unless you have something additional to add. I wanted to make sure that, so we've talked about groundfish here. I want to go back to the chat because Don provided some input with regards to salmon. And he said, regarding salmon FMP, November is the time frame for finalization of EWG input with council approval so that the preseason forecast will be completed in a timely manner. Draft EWG input could be reviewed in September. SAS in June through September is addressing in-season adjustments via a conference call. So Don, do you want to speak to that a bit?
Yeah, that's pretty much the process, but a couple things I want to just further detail. At the end of September, most of our community is out fishing. They're on the water. It's difficult to get, it's almost impossible to get them to a meeting. You may, on a very, very high interest issue, get some to participate in a conference call. So the timelines really don't have much variation on when we can meet or not meet or talk about items. And then the second piece I want to talk about is that in the Columbia Snake River Basin, we're starting to see a shift in objectives for salmon. For years, the council has managed to protect salmon in regard to the Endangered Species Act through the listing and various biological opinions. But we are starting to see a push to increase the number of salmon to get to healthy and sustainable harvestable levels. So those are going to be a little bit different set of risks factors that may show up. They may be the same. I don't know. But just be aware we could be looking at 2 objectives for harvest, maybe in the near term or maybe within the next decade. I'm not the expert on when you're going to have an answer for that timeline, but just be aware there could be 2 different outcomes on salmon harvest in the future.
Thanks for that, Don. Will, I see your hands up. Is there something you want to add?
Yeah, and maybe just to sort of make sure I'm on the same page as Don with respect to the timeline. I mean, the reference to the November deadline, you know, I'm assuming that's the reference to sort of the methodology review process, which and each year we can sort of review new methods, and the final step in adopting a new method is November. So if we were to come up with, or the EWG were to come up with some sort of new quantitative method of making use of ecosystem information to provide annual advice, that would, under the FMP, need to go through a one-time review process that would occur in November. But then once that process was approved, it's really each subsequent year would be sort of a March deadline for year-specific information. I don't think you would need to get year-specific approval for input every November. It's more new methods need approval in November, but year-specific input would probably be most useful in March. And I don't think you would need to have year-specific input before March, but maybe Don sees it differently.
No, I agree with you. When there are changes, that November period to complete the change would be appropriate so that then the forecasting process can commence.
Okay, so just so that I'm understanding this correctly, Will and Don, it sounds like whatever this initial process would be to incorporate ecosystem information or new ecosystem information on ramps or types into the salmon process, that would have to go through a one-time review in November, and then it can just be incorporated after that. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, and to get something on the agenda for that November review, you'd want to actually start in the April of that year, although I think you could add it as late as September.
Okay, so that's just something we'd want to add to that time frame of an initial kind of startup process. Thanks for that. Any other comments with regards to salmon timing and management? Don, I see your hand up. Do you have something additional to add?
No, I need to take my hand down. Sorry.
No worries. Okay. So I want to make sure we have time too to cover CPS. We definitely have gotten some feedback from the CPS MT on timeframes and how to incorporate information. Any additional comments, or does anyone else want to add any thoughts on, any initial startup times that might need to happen to actually start the process, similar to salmon, what we're hearing of, you have to have some type of review prior? Or do we feel like it's pretty straightforward?
So I'm going to find the report that you're referencing and add it to the chat. But if I remember correctly, the CPSMT was saying sort of March, April for their process.
Yes. So they said that in terms of timing for provided information, for setting these harvest specifications, it should incorporate information provided by the EWG or the ESR at the March meeting each year, and then additional information provided in the advanced briefing book for April and June meetings when CPS harvest specifications are considered. And that was kind of similar for the CPS-AS. Thanks for adding that to the chat, Yvonne. Any additional comments? Does anyone want to discuss these further? Otherwise, we can go back to groundfish if there's more discussion to be had there. Oh, I see a hand. Go ahead, Josh.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, I'm trying to, and looking at that MT report, there could be maybe some reconsideration of that timing, since both those meetings that they're referencing are straight to final action spec setting meetings, and whether or not that's giving the team enough time to digest, one of these tables or not. So thinking about that, and then typically these are based on annual or biennial stock assessments that get completed, or drafts get completed a few months prior, that perhaps there's an intersection there too, and thinking about the sort of P-star component, if it could help, or it's useful at those, say, review meetings, and Will or somebody else from the SSC could chime in here, at one of those assessment review meetings, to have this information to then, although we don't typically talk about Sigma and tiers at those, that maybe that'd be an opportunity to talk about those things, because for CPS, sometimes it isn't really, there are discussions, like it's not clear cut, is it tier 1, tier 2, and maybe this information could help inform a discussion around that topic at the stock assessment review meeting, recognizing we don't typically talk about that now at those meetings.
Thanks for that, Josh. Will, I see your hand up. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I largely just agree with what Josh said. I mean, I think, and yes, I mentioned sort of in the chat, I think recruitment is probably a bigger deal for CPS and Groundfish in terms of setting Sigma, and so ecosystem considerations that can inform on that, or on changes in natural mortality for that matter. That certainly would be useful, and I think like some star panels we have had sort of preliminary discussions of Sigma. So I do think it would be appropriate to bring that information forward at that point in time, as well as when the assessment is ultimately reviewed and adopted. But yeah, I think there is definite value in sort of bringing that forward during the stock assessment review process also.
Thanks for that.
No.
Michelle,
Thanks.
I see you're unmuted. Do you have something to add? Okay, just wanted to check. Any other comments or things that we should be considering when thinking about CPS? Oh, go ahead, Yvonne.
I just wanted to, I see some CPS experts in the list of participants, and including some folks from CDF and W, that I know that you have thought a lot about this. So just want to put you on the spot and see if you have anything to add about CPS management schedules, and make sure that we're getting the best information we can.
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. This is Kirkland. I just want to jump in there. I don't have anything to add. I think what's displayed there on there as far as the CPS schedules and assessments is in line with what's in our report. And I think Josh's comment is a good one too, that we do have those meetings, that this may come into those discussions at those assessment reviews as well. So thanks.
So Yvonne, I see your hand is still up.
Sorry, let me
No
put
worries.
that down.
Just searching the list. Anything else on this? Because I think kind of a final thought I have is that one thing I think is the EWG we need to think about is, as we go through these, tying this back to kind of the species priorities list, is also thinking about the time frames and how we put those two things together, right? If we're prioritizing certain species within certain FMPs, then what is the time frame in which we're also needing to have this kind of information happen? So really bringing those two together. And I think that there are ways in which we can make some broad recommendations, but some of these are going to be more specific. And so really thinking about what are those on-ramps for each one of these FMPs, and are there some on-ramps that are similar? when are they different, and what is that time frame, and kind of backtracking when we would need to start having information provided. I think is going to be something that I'm definitely thinking about, is how to put this in almost like FMP specific timelines, and then trying to make this overall timeline again of like, what actually does this mean from when information needs to start happening? Because there's going to be a bit of a time gap there that isn't represented on when the management action happens, but when that information needs to be finalized and included or summarized. Others thought on that process, or how to bring these two things together in a way that's more digestible? I think we could have a lot of tables, I think is where I'm kind of sitting right now, trying not to have that happen. And otherwise, I see that there's still some conversation about groundfish. So do we want to open that back up and have that conversation? I see like Katie and Michelle are having some discussion in the chat. Is there anything you want to add that we can incorporate into our consideration when thinking about these items from like an ecosystem work group perspective? Go ahead, Katie.
I think the only thing I would add is just it's quite hard to understand timing of everything. I understand the on-ramps and all that, but when I don't have a product in front of me, so I don't know how long it's going to take to incorporate, or like if it's just an easy thing like Michelle is saying or what have you. It's just hard to kind of think about these things without actually having the pilot project. So that to say that I withhold a full GMT, like, full timeline and like figuring out best path forward into the future after the pilot, until it is after the pilot and I see how things go.
Thanks, Katie. I think that's a good point. I think a lot of teams, and I think a lot of, people in general in council are struggling with what does this actually look like, and how would that be incorporated? So I think that's something good to consider with these pilots, is that we identify as many on-ramps as possible and try and show examples of what we mean for each, so that the different FMPs and different groups can start evaluating what that would look like and when that type of information would be needed and how they would incorporate it into that process. That's a good point. Thank you. Any other discussion? Otherwise, I'm going to turn it back to Yvonne with 5 minutes to spare.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who contributed. This was a really great conversation, and the EWG definitely appreciates everyone jumping on and jumping in. Great to have an active and engaged set of colleagues in this. So then it is 2:11 and we are at our final agenda item, which is public comment. And this is basically the part of the agenda where we can receive public comment on anything. So you don't have to, obviously relevant to the initiative, but doesn't have to be specific to whatever conversation we're having at the time. And so let's go with public comment, and then EWG. Then we'll talk a little bit about. Well, actually, maybe we should do this. So we are next meeting on Wednesday, and our meeting starts at 9 o'clock on Wednesday, and it's a shorter day. It's just 9 to noon. This is where the piloting starts. We're going to jump in and look at the risk classification table first. Mary Hunsaker is going to chair us for that, and that is the table that asks what risks are we going to consider and how do we generally characterize those? And then we are featuring petrale sole at 10 o'clock and sablefish at 11 o'clock. And so hopefully we'll come out with some drafts that we can share with the council and the advisory bodies. I don't know if we'll share the drafts before June, but maybe would definitely before September. So that's our definite schedule for Wednesday, 9 to noon, and our rough schedule for the next several weeks. So with that, I'm going to monitor for any blue hands that might be raised for comments, questions, concerns, what have you, from the public. All right, Mike Okanuski, thank you.
It's a real simple one. Is there public comments allowed on Wednesday?
Yes, well, I think we
Okay.
have to.
Okay.
And then I should say to everyone, this Ring Central has this awesome feature where if you go to the chat and you look on the right hand side, there's a download chat option. I'm going to download the chat before I leave because there's a lot of good stuff in that chat. So sorry for, go ahead, Mike. Did you have anything else before I?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much.
Also with the download chat, if you click on the transcript button on the right, hopefully that's open to everyone. You can also download the transcribed conversations we've had. So it's quasi verbatim notes with probably a lot of interpretation errors by the computer.
I guess as we're chiming in on what will be available, I'll just mention the recording. So I have recorded the audio and the video for what that's worth. And so that we'll get that posted on our website. Usually we just put that under the page for the notice for the particular meeting. And I'll work with Chris on that, and whether we wait until after Wednesday or do today's tomorrow and so on and so forth, I don't know. But at some point by the end of the week, those recordings will be available as well.
Okay. Anyone else have questions, comments, concerns, ideas? Everybody's probably pretty tired after today. Go ahead, Don.
One thing that may be of interest, the council's been setting salmon seasons for decades. It'd be, I don't know if we'd have the time or the resources to look at what may be the drivers for setting those quotas and seasons from year to year. That may help understand from a background when we get ready to do salmon, what might be some factors that are affecting this process, but that's purely a blue sky thought that I don't want to make it a demand, but it's just maybe something to think about at some point in time.
Can you give us some examples of that? Because
well, like this year, the fishery was closed south of Falcon for Chinook due to water management issues in California. This year, our season was set by limitations on Lower Columbia Tule and the Columbia system. If there's something maybe of that next layer down that might be ferreted out from historical records or not, I don't know if it's even available, but a highlight like that might give you a body of knowledge where certain factors might become your drivers, per se.
Thank you. That is a great suggestion and comment. I will just say I've had a long career with NIMS, and in the council process, we're always worried about the next question, the next season, the next harvest level, and sometimes we don't do such a great job sort of looking back and asking why we did what we did and how well it may or may not have worked out, or whether it worked out as we had intended. And so I really appreciate that comment and thought, because it could be quite enlightening. So thank you. Let's see, does anyone else have any? I'm not seeing blue hands, but that might be me. Okay. Oh, Jessica, it looks like
Sorry.
you have a hand up. No, go ahead.
Yeah, just a process question. So between today and Wednesday, when we meet, is there tasks for the EWG that we should be prioritizing? Sorry if I missed that.
No, rest your brains. Maybe just take a quick look at the draft tables that we have, or at least we just have table outlines, really. And, you know, think about some of what we heard from Stephanie and Corey when you're out walking your dog or brushing your teeth or what have you, and see if anything bubbles up. That's all.
Thanks.
Okay. With that, I'm just going to double check. We'll do another going once, going twice, but it looks like we don't have any more hands. And we're ready to go. Okay, so thank you so much, EWG, for different folks chairing and taking notes and adding to the discussion. And thank you, everyone who came and joined us and added to the conversation today. I really felt like, you know, this was a much more rich conversation than we could have had without you and all of your ideas and your verbal and written comments. So it's been a huge help to have all of this today, and really want to thank you so much for joining us. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day. And we will see you again on Wednesday at 9 o'clock.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.